Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Maimela. I'm the Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Law. I'll be directing this program today as well as tomorrow. So you are stuck with me for the next 2 days. In Inhlekani, Ralocha, Tobela, Matseare, Kuyedag, good afternoon. We welcome you to the University of Pretoria, where sunshine, diversity, transformation, excellence in teaching and learning and research is at the heart of our business, working with the communities surrounding the university. We are a university that welcomes and embraces technology, but human beings lie at the center of it all. Being host of the second Colloquium on language under the umbrella of USAF, which emanated from the revised language policy framework for higher education. Last year, a similar colloquium was organized at Stellenbosch University in order to see how public universities can come up with ways to make the framework a reality. And UP, as host for the second leg, will also aim to take the work forward to ensure acceleration and realization of the framework in applying and developing indigenous languages in teaching and learning as well as in research. Ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce and call upon the VC to welcoming you to the University of Pretoria, allow me to say that indigenous languages are not only means of communication, but are part and parcel of indigenous people's cultures and religions. This calls upon public universities not to do lip service in this endeavor, but ensure that indigenous languages in their teaching and research do not compromise the cultural and religious rights of the people concerned. This will be a grave injustice. Ladies and gentlemen, a few house rules before I invite the Vice-Chancellor. The registration is at the front desk. Bathrooms for both males and females are on the hallway. And if you have any emergencies, please feel free to contact us. The colleagues from DIA are right at the back. Colleagues, a brief bio of the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Kupe. Professor Tawana Kupe has been the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria since 2019. He holds a DPhil in Media Studies from the University of Oslo, Norway. In December 2019, he received an honorary doctorate from Michigan State University in the US and another from France University of Montpellier in October 2021. Prof. Kupe has a notable publication record, having authored journal articles, books, and book chapters in his main discipline, media studies and journalism. He's an active member of several civil society organizations and is a board member of a number of tertiary education networks, organizations, and initiatives around the world. With this brief bio, I'd like now to invite the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Kupe.
Thank you very much, Professor Maimela, Program Director. Good afternoon, colleagues. Dumelang, Rialocha, Tobela, Sanibonani, Molweni, Dimasiri, Inhlakani, Huyemidag, Lochani. Dr. Petiwe Matutu, the Chief Executive of University South Africa, Professor Langa Kumalo, the Chair of COPAL, Professor Danhua, the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Vaal University of Technology, and other Vice Chancellors joining us virtually, Deputy Vice Chancellors and representatives from other institutions, all speakers and participants in today and tomorrow's sessions, members of the steering committee, and all guests. I've been looking forward to this colloquium with great anticipation for three main reasons. First, it is a joy to be in the same room with you all, including the virtual room, by the way. When Professor Wim de Villiers of Stellenbosch University welcomed us to the first USAF Corpal Vice Chancellor's Language Colloquium in the spring of 2021, held virtually, there was a note of wistfulness in his voice as he remarked what a pity it was that we were not all in the meeting in person. There was general concurrence with that sentiment. Well, here we are at the University of Pretoria. Is honored to be your host, and for many of you in person. You are all most welcome. The second reason I've been eagerly anticipating this all-important second language colloquium is that it is expected to contribute to some much needed certainty and clarity on various issues that are critical to the successful sector-wide implementation of the language policy framework for public higher education institutions. You will recall that the Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, Dr. Bonginkosi Blaine Zimande, published the language policy framework in the Government Gazette on 30 October 2020. On an initial reading of the policy framework, one is struck by its brevity and succinctness. Consisting of only 18 pages, the framework does an admirable job of providing a high-level view of what public universities must do to promote multilingualism in our teaching and learning, research, scholarly discourse, official communication, and administration. With further rereading of the framework, it became evident that the detail of how to go about implementing the policy has not been spelled out. That is arguably a good thing, and I'm sure intentional. This policy framework takes South African universities into completely untrodden territory, and no one can be said to have all of the answers. Furthermore, being the intellectual hubs that they are, universities can make a rich and meaningful contribution as to how the framework should unfold in practice in our lecture rooms, at our conferences, in our research, and in our internal and external communication, among others. Also wisely, the policymakers have opted to provide firm parameters within which we all must work while allowing the flexibility to accommodate institutional autonomy and our circumstances on the ground. A very delicate balance there. Yet to implement the policy framework effectively, individually and collectively, it is important to have a good grasp of what is required of us. Someone who has put this very well is Professor Langa Khumalo, Executive Director of the South African Center for Digital Language Resources and Chairperson of the USAF Community of Practice for African Languages, who's of course here with us today. According to a report on the USAF website, Professor Khumalo, speaking at a Corpal meeting in March 2021, said of the policy framework, and I quote, "We really need to tease it apart and understand it. Then we can actually begin to say we're implementing the new language policy for higher education," close quote. For the higher education sector, the teasing apart of the policy framework began in earnest at the first USAF Corpal Vice Chancellor's Language Colloquium in September 2021. There, with the guidance of experts from Corpal and the Departments of Higher Education and Training, Science and Innovation, Basic Education, and Arts and Culture, we began unpacking the policy framework and exploring how we could successfully implement it. The teasing out continues today and tomorrow, when we will be discussing a number of pressing aspects that are key to implementing multilingualism across our universities. These include the language resources audit that sadly had been conducting across the sector, and the resources that the Department of Higher Education and Training is able to make available for implementation. Equally, we are all eager to share the successes and challenges we have encountered so far in taking the first steps or more advanced steps in some cases towards embedding multilingualism across our operations. This teasing out process has, I believe, given us a sense of the true magnitude of the task awaiting us as the South African higher education sector. Implementing the policy framework is not a matter of introducing a couple of multilingual academics here or issuing some multilingual messages there. That is tokenism. It's a tick box exercise. It is very big, very ambitious, and make no mistake, very necessary. Successfully implementing multilingualism at our universities is essential if we are to do what the South African Constitution demands, which is to strengthen the use of all official languages across all the functional domains of higher education in our country. As the policy framework notes, language still stands in the way of success for many students at our higher education institutions. Yet the task is huge and complex. The transformation of language policies and practices at our higher education institutions calls for systemic, and serious transformation of our language policies and practice on a scale that few, if any other higher education systems in the world have attempted. This brings me to the third reason why I've been looking forward to this second VC's language colloquium. It is an opportunity to collaborate and co-create like never before. I'm reminded of the words of Professor Ahmed Bawa in his address at last year's Yusuf Kopal Vice Chancellor's Language Colloquium. Professor Bawa, as you know, is our immediate past CEO. I quote, "When I look back at the last 18 months, the only way we were able to weather the storm of COVID-19 was by working together as a sector, working together with the government and the private sector. It is about understanding the benefits of working together, in essence, co-creating solutions," close quote. Leading the way with collaborations is Kopal itself, which brings together language experts from most South African universities and is expanding that by seeking collaboration with the Pan-South African Language Board, PANSAB as you know, is often called, collaboration is also built into the DNA of this SADLA, and which is making many important digital resources available to universities and other stakeholders in the interest of promoting the use and development of all our official languages. Some interinstitutional collaborations on multilingualism have already been established, such as the University of Pretoria's partnership with the University of Cape Town to develop an open educational resource term bank. Funded by a grant from the Department of Higher Education and Training, this term bank offers terms in English and the other 10 official languages for disciplines from accounting and anthropology to family medicine and literature. It is free for anyone to use. This is just the start. My hope for this colloquium is that we will work together as a sector to make multilingualism in higher education work and become the norm. That we will freely share our experiences and experimentations and seek out every possible opportunity for collaboration and partnership as we co-create ways to use the power of language to make higher education more accessible and equitable than ever before. Once again, I really welcome you to the University of Pretoria and to this colloquium. Le amohatswe siyanamukela vo tanganedzwa mi amukelekile. Welcome namukelekile.
Thank you, Professor Cooper, for the warm welcome of the colleagues. What I highlighted from the welcome of the father of the institution, Professor Cooper, is co-create and collaboration is crucial in this endeavor of languages. And also, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, languages are communal by their nature, not individualistic. And it speaks to the drive of universities of transdisciplinarity and collaboration. By the way, the theme which we are going with this year of the colloquium is moving the conversation forward. Multilingualism in higher education, harnessing the resources. Without further ado, let me now invite to the podium Dr. Petiwe Matutu, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Universities South Africa, and her brief bio reads as follows. Dr. Matutu is USAF's new Executive Chief Executive Officer, effective from 1 October 2022. For the immediate past 5 years, she was the Group Executive Strategy, Planning and Partnerships at the National Research Foundation, NRF, where she was responsible for long-term strategy. Prior to her tenure at the NRF, Dr. Matutu had been a Chief Director, Human Capital and Science Promotion in the former Department of Science and Technology. A mathematician by discipline, Dr. Matutu's career was launched in academia, where for 16 years she focused her teaching on making mathematics accessible, particularly to the previously marginalized groups. Her teaching career culminated in a senior lectureship at Rhodes University's Department of Mathematics in 2004, a position she held until 2008. In policymaking circles, Dr. Matutu served in various committees and structures, including the Ministerial Task Team for the drafting of the implementation plan for the White Paper on Post-School Education and Training in the Department of Higher Education and Training. It's important that I read these profiles to brag that we have esteemed colleagues in our midst at UP. Over to you, Dr. Matutu.
Thank you very much to the program director. We lose patience when people read these bios. Professor Tawane Kupe, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria and the co-host for the colloquium today. Professor Kwesi Pra, the keynote speaker for the colloquium. Professor Dan Khwadi, the Vice Chancellor of Vaal University of Technology. The Deputy Vice Chancellors present here, Professor Songa from UKZN, Professor Kit, Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Engela van Staden, University of Free State, Professor Charles Maimela, our Program Director, Professor Langa Kumalo, the Chairperson of the Community of Practice for Teaching and Learning of African Languages, COPAL, the language experts from COPAL, senior executives of universities, representatives from the Department of Higher Education and Training, the National Research Foundation, the Council for Higher Education, Universities South Africa senior staff members, Colloquium, organizing team, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Universities South Africa, I'm delighted to deliver the opening address at this Vice Chancellor's Colloquium on the new language policy for higher education institutions. Let me outline the chronology of events that has led us to today's colloquium. Professor Pra was asking about our policy. I hope that that will clarify that. In 2002, the Minister of Education developed and promulgated the Language for Higher Education policy. The aim of the policy was to promote multilingualism in institutional policies and practices of South African public higher education institutions. Following that, among other initiatives, in 2015, the minister had a ministerial task team which produced a report on the use of African languages as mediums of instruction in higher education. Sadly, the report showed that little progress had been made in exploring and exploiting the potential of African languages in facilitating access and success in higher education institutions. It was at this stage that Universities South Africa, which is a representative body of the 26 public universities, realized the enormity of the problem at implementing that language policy, which was promulgated in 2002. USAF supported the development of the community of practice for teaching and learning of African Languages, which we normally call COPAL. As such, in 2016, COPAL was established in response to the need for transformation in higher education, and specifically transformation of language policies at universities so as to be more socially inclusive and representative. In 2020, the Minister of Higher Education, Science and Technology promulgated the language policy framework for higher education institutions. As Prof. Kupe has mentioned, that remains at policy level with space for universities to still interpret and implement. The aim of this framework is to promote multilingualism as a strategy to facilitate meaningful access and participation by university communities, students, staff, in various university activities, including cognitive and intellectual development. The need for the USAF COPAL to work with universities in the sector, the senior management, and executives towards developing an understanding implementation framework was identified in 2021. So the USAF COPAL has worked tirelessly towards reaching its objectives, one of which is the implementation of the new language policy for higher education and the use of African languages as languages of teaching and learning in universities in order to achieve social justice and to advance student success. To this end, the first in a series of 3 Vice-Chancellor Colloquia was hosted by Stellenbosch University on the 28th to 29th September 2021. That event was a resounding success and brought various stakeholders in the sector together to debate and deepen understanding of the key issues and requirements laid out in the language policy framework. USAF, as a representative body of the 26 universities, endorses a comprehensive and equitable national higher education system that is responsive to the challenges facing South Africa. Through lobbying, advocacy, USAF promotes and facilitates an optimal environment conducive for universities to function effectively and maximally contribute to social, cultural, and economic advancement of South Africa and its people. It also enables universities to promote a values-driven academic mission, relevance and responsiveness. I'm mentioning this because, as you can hear, USAF has been quite responsive through the establishment of COPAL. And this COPAL reports to our Teaching and Learning Strategy Group, which is chaired by a Vice-Chancellor. And that strategy group reports to the Board of University South Africa, which is constituted by all Vice-Chancellors of public universities. So in that sense, I would say strategically, the COPAL is well placed to deliver, to influence whatever the needs are within the advancement of the African languages. The second VC language policy colloquium, with its theme, that is the one that we're in now, moving the conversation forward, multilingualism in higher education and harnessing the resources needed for implementation, aligns strongly with USAF's mission and is seen as a very important engagement in moving the conversation of advancing our African languages forward. I'm thrilled to declare this colloquium open. I look forward to our deliberations as we build on the past achievements and move the conversation forward. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Matutu, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The colloquium is officially opened. We can deliberate. Universities are spaces of deliberation, disagreements, and engagements. So also what the COO indicated there was the aspect of social justice and to empower students in this important endeavor. So there's the green light from USAF that we are continuing. And as universities, we must continue and be deliberate in this endeavor. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like now to invite Professor Langa Khumalo, who is just to give us the background and expected outcomes of this colloquium, and is going to address us this afternoon by providing the objectives of the colloquium and the expected outcomes that will embed the implementation of the new policy framework. I will not do injustice to him by not introducing him. I will introduce him as well. Professor Khumalo is the Executive Director of the South African Center for Digital Language Resources at Northwest University. Professor Khumalo is also the former Director of Language Planning and Development at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He holds a PhD in Linguistics from the University of Oslo in Norway and an MPhil in Linguistics from Cambridge University in the UK. He's also a certificate in Corpus Linguistics from the Tuscan Word Center in Italy. He is the current chair and coordinator of the African Union isiZulu Language Commission. He's an expert in corpus linguistics and computational solutions for the African Academy of Languages. He's also the chair of the University of South Africa's Community of Practice for the Teaching and Learning of African Languages and the president of the African Association of Lexicography. He served as a member of the Language Policy Review Working Group appointed by the Department of Higher Education and Training, which produced the current language policy framework for higher education. So if we identify faults with this framework, we look at him. He's an award-winning author in intelligent text processing and computational linguistics. He recently completed the Oxford Strategic Leadership Program with a CERD Business School at the University of Oxford, UK. Professor Khumalo, welcome, Baba.
Ngiyabonga mfethu. Ngiyabonga kakhulu. Good afternoon, colleagues. I think in my salutations on my slides, there is a betrayal of the time in which academics write their speeches. And I'm sorry about that. It was too early in the morning. And I saluted you as with the good mornings and mores. I apologize about that. But to formally start, the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe, who has given us very strong words of welcome, words that I think, if I were to be fair, have actually framed the discourse of this colloquium and what it is expected to do. But I'll reiterate that since academics are very wordy people. The CEO of University South Africa, Dr. Petio Matutu, our keynote speaker, and an elder in our community where we work, and to me, a real mentor, Professor Kwesi Kwapra, whom I've worked with for many years now, and I'm very happy and privileged to be in his company today. All Vice Chancellors that are here present, Professor Dan Hwadi, who is our immediate Vice Chancellor at the Northwest University, and the current Vice Chancellor at VUT, and all the Vice Chancellors that are attending virtually, members of council of our universities that are here present, student leadership, who provide a very important voice to this policy, and we will be privileged to hear their reactions to the policy and what they expect of the universities to do in terms of operationalizing the language policy. Program Director, Mfowethu Solwazi Maimela. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to provide a simple preface to this colloquium. And I know that the Vice Chancellor and the CEO of Yusuf have provided that context. But it is a sequel of the first that took place at Stellenbosch University. And one of the many objectives of that colloquium was to appreciate the requirements of the new language policy framework. We needed, according to our interactions with the then CEO, Professor Bauer, to understand the philosophical underpinnings of the policy framework in order for us to appreciate the amount of work that we need to apply in responding to the framework. And I think that's when the conversation started to deepen our understanding of the framework, its import and its strategic demands, and to link all the institutional language policies to align to the new framework as articulated in the new policy document. The theme of the second colloquium is moving the conversation forward. Multilingualism in higher education, harnessing the resources. And I think the key part is in the last bullet, harnessing the resources that are required to operationalize this language policy framework in order to transition from what Professor Kwesi Pra has criticized the previous policy document as pious articles of faith that have no force nor effect. So this one must never fall into the trap that the previous ones have fallen into by lacking the vehicle through which we can operationalize the policy, the strategy to action, the import of the new policy framework for higher education institutions. So it emerged at the Stellenbosch colloquium that the resources are at the center of our conversation, that we require to get a sense of what the institutions have by way of policy documents and implementation strategies, and that COPAL needed to lead the process to align individual university institutions to the national framework as espoused in the current document. And that last year, a conversation needed to be deepened in order to look at how the universities are functioning in their current spaces, what the gaps are in terms of expertise that is required, in terms of the infrastructure that is required, and in terms of funding that is required to give expression to the new language policy for higher education institutions. So this year's colloquium aims to provide, in the first instance, this space as a platform for robust intellectual engagement on multilingualism in higher education. That's where the teasing continues. Provide a platform to define, to identify, and to assess the critical resources that are required to give effect to the implementation of multilingualism in the academy. Because if we don't understand the range of resources in their whole gamut, then we will miss that which is vitally important in providing the action required. to critically engage on the challenges public higher education institutions face in implementing the new language policy framework, and we're hoping to get that from the expert point of view from our COPAL leadership. And further, to engage with the Department of Higher Education and Training on the available commitments in implementing the language policy framework. And we're hoping that that contribution to the conversation is going to provide a framework from which we can actually advance this conversation in a practical way. And also, finally, to bring higher education leaders together to reflect on their progress in implementing the new language policy for higher education as outlined in the new framework. So the expected outcomes have been enumerated as just only 2 outcomes, so that, again, we don't lose ourselves in the detail of the 18-page document. So the organizing committee thought that the outcomes of this colloquium should provide the vice chancellors, and indeed all of us, an appreciation that advances the institutions in moving towards implementing this language policy framework. We must feel that the conversation has actually moved us closer to implementing this language policy framework. But most importantly, to collectively, if we can, develop a model that will enable the sharing of resources in order to implement the new language policy framework effectively across the academy. Professor Cooper said this task is by no means a small task. It's a huge task, and we must commit to it. But it provides us an opportunity to look at these shared challenges and provide a shared solution in order to advance our universities and indeed translate this language policy into something that is clearly implementable and successfully implementable. Program Director, I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kumalo, for those insights and setting the tone and expected outcomes for the Vice Chancellors and the 26 public universities. But from listening to you, what you really said, particularly to DHEAD, is more money, more money, more money, so that this becomes a reality. Harnessing the resources to make the framework a reality. That's very important. But ladies and gentlemen, those in the Senate Hall and those in the online platform, maybe just to pause a little bit as to what Professor Kumalo has just shared. In my work on transformation, particularly curriculum transformation, when you speak of it in universities, and I've also engaged with a number of colleagues in other universities, we always encounter this unfortunate question as to how. It's quite an unfortunate question, that how do we implement transformation? It's simple, the answer. Give us resources and space to implement it. Space speaks to the institutional culture of the universities which we operate in order to achieve the stated objectives. So I hope in future that question will no longer be asked. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are getting into the real business. We are now getting into the keynote address, where colleagues in the auditorium, as well as those online, we have been waiting for the keynote address, which is going to be delivered by Professor Kwesi Pra, who is the founder and former director for the Center of Advanced Studies of African Society. His keynote address today is titled, Providing Critical Perspectives on Language as a Social Justice Imperative, an Important Vehicle for Social Development and Learning in South Africa. The brief bio of Professor Pra is, He is the founder and former director of the Center for Advanced Studies of African Society based in Cape Town. He was educated at the Universities of Leiden and Amsterdam. He has worked extensively across Africa, Europe, and Asia, researching and teaching sociology and anthropology in various universities, including Makerere University. I think there's a mistake because it speaks of lynching. I was about to run away in the bio, which is not the case. Colleagues in DIA will be sued as a university. Professor Pra is an anthropology Professor Pa has also worked extensively across Africa, Europe, and Asia, researching and teaching in the various universities, including Makerere University, Uganda University of Zurubia, University of Botswana and Swaziland, University of Juba, Sudan, Cape Coast University, Ghana, National University of Lesotho, University of Namibia, University of the Western Cape, University of Heidelberg, the Amsterdam Municipal University, and the Institute for West African and African Studies in China. Professor Pra has also been a nullified fellow and associate at the Center for African Studies in Cambridge University and served as a professorial research fellow at the Namibia Economic Policy Research Unit. He is currently engaged with the University of Zululand. Professor Pra has written many and lots of books to which I will not go through, but we welcome you, our elder, and a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, colleagues. It is my great pleasure to have the opportunity to share some ideas this afternoon, some questions, some issues concerning our languages and what we're doing with our languages in the face of the tremendous difficulties that we as Africans face in the world today in general, and the problems we're addressing specifically in the South African instance. It is obvious to anybody who cares to understand what goes on in the world that we are the least developed, I'm talking about in global terms, the least culturally empowered to deal with the problems we face as Africans, the least respected, largely because of our inability to be able to do anything about our problems. And so the task you have given me this afternoon would be, from my viewpoint, to provoke your minds to think even more seriously. You see, because we tend in Africa often to address a problem skirt round it, go round it decade after decade, saying the correct things that we should say superficially, but succeed in doing little precious, which corrects the situation. I say this, we're addressing the problems we face in South Africa. But I say this with the full recognition that it is not only South Africa which has these problems. It is right across Africa. In any case, when we talk about our languages, if we talk about the Sotho-Tswana group, it's all over Southern Africa. It is not just here. It is in Namibia. It is in Botswana. It is in Lesotho. It is in Zambia. It is, and all the languages of Africa are like that. They have no respect, our languages have no respect for the colonial borders imposed on us about 120, 130 years ago. These languages have been with us for thousands of years in the making, in the evolution. They have shaped our character, our history, our values. These languages carry our memory as Africans. Without these languages, we have no memory as Africans. These languages are the instruments which in every instance in the world, with any other group, are the foundational structures on which the whole idea of advancement and development is built. Humans live in cultures. I'm worried often these days by the fashionability, the tendency to talk in endless circles about decoloniality. People borrowing the ideas of Mignolo and the other South Americans. Because I have a bit of an advantage of age. Within 2 weeks, I will be 80 years young. So I have seen a lot of these intellectual fashions. Intellectual big swear words from the end of the 50s. We've seen them come and go. Tossed in one university after the other. One thing I can say about them, most of them are created in social, historical, and cultural milieus which have nothing to do with Africans. They are therefore only limited in applicability to our realities. So I wonder, and I'm scared, worried about these tendencies to go into postmodernism and every new fashion which is thrown out into Parisian salons of intellect are embraced by Africa. And we achieve little with them. We discard them after 4 or 5 years and we pick up the next fashion which is all from the West. That is the situation with the question of decoloniality and so on. In the 60s, from the same source in the world, that is mainly Latin America. At that time, neo-Marxian ideas of center, periphery, Gunda Frank, Elio Jaguaribe. It was a time that Samir Amin emerged in Africa with the idea of delinking. People are still talking about delinking. Now, I'm asking you, please, to be original. The problems we face in Africa require originality. We are intellectuals in our own right. We stand on our own feet. There is nobody in the world who is better than us. We have to dig, and I have experienced this, working with Cassius over the past 20 years, people like this distinguished linguist we have here, that Africa today has enough linguists, first-class linguists, capable of doing any work that we need to have done on this continent. There is no doubt in my mind. I have worked with enough to know that we have all the manpower that we need to transform the society linguistically in the way that we want it. The question is, why are we not doing it? That is the real question. The question is, why are we not mobilizing to effect the resources, the human resources, the intellectual resources we have to be able to achieve this? This is what I want to provoke your minds about this afternoon. This is what I want to place before you. We have also the advantage, a unique advantage in the world. I guess only a small proportion of us will be guessing what I'm going to say. Oh, I see some messages. I must speak to the mic. The problem is that in South Africa, of all the places in Africa, of all the points on the globe in Africa, South Africa has a unique and specially endowed position with regards to the experience of using a language as a language of development and transforming a society. I always tell people that there are 3 linguistic miracles in the last 130, 20 years. The first one is, of course, modern Hebrew of Ben Yehuda, the work of people like Ben Yehuda and his people from the late 19th century, the closing stages of the 19th century in Israel, developing a new version of Hebrew, modern Hebrew, for the people of Israel. And within 25 years, succeeding by 1913, from rudiments, they succeeded in creating a version of Hebrew and the lexicals necessary to be able to teach any scientific work at the tertiary level. That's people who are serious. You see, people who know what they want, people who take a decision and implement the decision. The second miracle is a miracle of Afrikaans. It was only in the 1870s that the national aspirations and realization of the Afrikaner group as a Dutch derivative, but distant enough to want to make themselves separate from the Dutch and also separate from the British and the English as a people, started when they said, ik ben een Afrikaner, or something. It's the only 1870s. It's not so long ago. It's not so long ago. The wars they fought with the British at a cultural level were wars to assert their distinct cultural nature and history. And from small beginnings, they started creating a version of the language. But it was only after the Act of Union, after the Treaty of Vereeniging, within 18 months of that, they were working on the new orthography, and on orthography, the first existing spelling system for the language. You see? 1913, they produced the first standardized orthography spelling system. It was only 1913, for heaven's sake, that the orthography, the rules of spelling, were written. The same year, they introduced it to primary schools. That's people who are serious. Not people who came and make speech once a year about developing languages and make pious and long speeches in parliament and so on for nothing. But people who are serious about something. 5 years later, in 1918, it was in the universities. In 1925, it was in parliaments. The British laughed at them, the English. So these people, they speak 2 sentences in Africa. They are so-called new language, and then they branch into English, and then they go back into the Afrikaans. We were laughing at them. 1933, there emerged the first Bible in their language. So in a space of from 1913 to the 1933, that's 20 years. Within about 5 years of that, 25 years, you could study anything in the world in the language written. 25 years. How many years have we put apartheid behind us? 1994. How many years? I'm sorry I drift, allow my emotions to carry me into anger and so on. But I'm serious about it. It is a serious matter. These are people who are serious then about their language, who realize the value of a language. One of the more difficult and unacceptable for our purposes as Africans, the political, Malan, D.F. Malan. He made a statement, lift the language and you lift the people. This is a simple truth. Lift the language and you lift the people. Do we not understand this? Why don't simple things like this, which makes sense to anybody in the world, do we really want to live the people? Do we want to live the African people? Or are we playing lip service? Are we serious about this? I believe that this constituency, the intellectuals, the flower of our thought, have the capacity to change the equation. We have the capacity to make enough noise to tell the politicians that, come on, you better get your act straight. If we don't do that, then we are complicit in the processes which keep our people down, that we pretend. We come, we make speeches in English and French and Portuguese, beautiful speeches. We're all capable of doing this, but we are not serious people. And we don't deserve any respect. How can we expect others to respect us when we don't respect our own languages? Do we understand? The third linguistic miracle is Bahasa, Bahasa Melayu, from the Malay archipelago, 5,000 islands. They have other languages, but there is a lingua franca, Bahasa. In 1928, when the nationalist movement of the Indonesians was beginning, the youth, the students, young students, after 300 years of Dutch colonialism, announced that they are struggling for independence, and when they get their independence, Bahasa will be their language, not Dutch. True enough, 20 years later, in 1948, 3 years after the defeat of Japan, because Japan had entered the archipelago in 1941-42. Remember, the Japanese swept Southeast Asia at the beginning of the Second World War. They announced in 1948 that they're using Bahasa. The time I was at school in the Netherlands, in the beginning of the 1960s, there were lots of some of my friends, the Indonesians, because they were colonized by the Dutch. So there were lots of them in Holland in those days. They were telling me that the easiest thing to do was to move from Indonesia to Malaysia to teach Bahasa. Malaysia got its independence August 57, 7 months after Ghana. Today, you can go to universities in Malaysia with Malay, Bahasa. In Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in that part of the world, they do everything in Bahasa. They don't use Dutch. If you speak Dutch, nobody understands you. Nobody knows what you're talking about. These are serious people. People who understand their interests. People who want to create everything that can be created everywhere in the world. Manufacture everything in their own languages, so that the people are empowered with knowledge. And the knowledge lifts the people up. If we are able to use our languages completely in education, within 10, 15 years we will transform our villages, everywhere, rural places. Knowledge will be owned by the masses of a people. Maybe that's what we don't want. That's why we have these small meetings, speaking English, talking to ourselves, pretending that we are competing with Shakespeare in his language, and being happy with that. That is our problem. We are like birds sitting on a tree built in languages which are not our own. And we are expecting these birds, the same birds, to cut these branches because our power, culturally, rests on the fact that we use these colonial languages. That is what we are about. You go around Africa, you will see. In some countries, you can't get into parliament if you can't speak English. I remember some years ago meeting a lady from West Africa, who speaks French, who told me that French is an African language now. A lady, a writer. You see, I looked at the lady, I thought, what has happened to this creature? She was saying in my face that French is an African language. Remember, one of the famous sayings of the person who wrote the grammar, the initial grammar of Spanish. Spanish is, of course, what is this Spanish? Is Spanish Castilian they're talking about. Antonio de Nebrija. He wrote the grammar of Castilian, which became the language of Spain, the dominant language of Spain, which they imposed on the other people there, the Basques, the Catalans, and the other people. But this was, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 1492. It's around about the same time that Columbus arrived in. It was in the same year that they chased the Moors out of Andalusia back into Africa. And they entered Africa and conquered the Ghana Empire, the first empire in the Western Sahel. They are Arabized Africans who were used, Arabized Africans, speaking Arabic. They say Arabic is the language of God. So lose your language. You lose your language, you adopt Arabic, and they can send you with the religion to war. Yes. Antonio de Nebrija said, it is a well-known fact that the language is the main instrument of empire building. Spanish America, made of 450 million people now, had Spanish imposed. The Spaniards butchered the Mayans, for example, imposed their language on them. And the results that we have now is what we see. The people have lost their languages. They are a dying breed, dying in the sense that when I say dying breed, I don't mean that they physically die, because people hardly die in that way. When cultures die, the people die. The people become other people. They exist as people, but they become other people. They speak other people's language, languages they've adopted. They think it's hip. They adopt, from one step, it leads to the other, they adopt their religion. You see? And they, as a people, as a cultural representation, because people are first and foremost cultural groups. There is no difference between people in terms of biology. whether you are blue, green, or gold, whether you are short or tall, whether you are a man or a woman, you have different capacities. No. We are different only in as far as our cultures are different. There is nothing like a black mind or a white mind. You can't mix biology with culture. They are opposites. But therefore we can say that everywhere in the world where historically you see a minority language being used by a people, you have either imperialism, colonialism as a direct imposition from our side, or internal colonialism, of one group in the society imposing on the others. And this has nothing to do with color. This is part of the reason why we have wars in Ethiopia from the Amhara group, which imposed its language and culture as a language of superior caste on the other people. This is why, for example, the Irish, there's white people, the English are also white, but the English introduced colonialism there, destroyed the people, butchered them, imposed their language on them, nearly wiped out their language. It was only after the rising in 1916, the famous Easter Rising, and the civil war that followed, that the Irish reintroduced their language, took it to university. Today, you can study anything in Irish again. The Welsh, they were the first to suffer from English, the English. It's white against white. It's not white against black or black against white or black against blue. But the Welsh, they almost wiped their language out. It's only since they had some devolution, what they call devolution, regional government administration, now that the language is coming back again. The language is coming back. We face this challenge in Africa. And we are focusing on the task ahead, the practical challenges in South Africa. But we cannot solve the problem totally within the borders of South Africa. Please understand that very carefully. The Nguni languages are to be found practically in the whole of Southern Africa. They are in Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Swaziland. If we have, and there are people here who have been instrumental, like Professor Lange Kumalu, in producing a new harmonized. I never hear anybody talking about the harmonized orthographies that you have produced. And yet we want to talk about developing the languages, using the languages in university and using it for university framework and this and that and that and that. But the starting point is that you must have an orthographic system. And you have produced it. Why don't you get ahead with it, for heaven's sake? The same thing is true for the Sotho-Tswana. We've done that for Venda. We've done that for Tsonga, the Shangaan, Ronga, that cluster. It's been done for 85% of the whole of Africa in 22 years. Oh, they're here. Some of them are here. Who did this work? That is where it must start. Make it available everywhere. Send it to primary schools. Let people give a few prizes for people to write using these harmonized. These harmonized orthographies were done by the best linguists that we have in Africa. The best. Our topmost, the cream. There are orthographies which, if a Chinese linguist looks at them, will come to the same conclusions. What I want to say is that the scientific standards are so high and universal. There's no doubt about their scientific quality. We need monolingual dictionaries. CAS has produced 9 of them. We need more monolingual, not English, Zulu, Zulu dictionary. No. Let the English people do that, if they are interested in it. We need Zulu Zulu, or Nguni Nguni, a unified Nguni or a dictionary. Please don't waste time about this. I'm tired of talking year in, year out about this. And don't tell me about resources that are required. It's our national anthem. You're always talking about resources, resources. We don't need more than 200, 300,000 rands to do this. It's the salary of a professor for 4 months, 5 months to do this work. So please, let's not tell ourselves lies. Now, I'm sorry that I get myself worked up also when I think about this. I try not to work myself up, but I end up working myself up. But our task, our challenge is a big one. We need more determination, resolution, steadfastness, diligence to do this work. So please tell the ministers, Mr. Bladen Monday and all the rest of them, tell them the task is not so big, it's not unsurmountable if we are serious. And the lesson is not far. The Afrikaans example is right under our noses. It's our fellow citizens. Look at how they did it. Look at the determination with which they did it. Within 25 years, we have had all this time since the end of apartheid. It's the same time they took from 0 to everything. And we are still talking here about how we are going to do something in the future. Okay, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I think I have made the point. The work can be done. We have the expertise. We have the expertise. We don't have to go to France or Germany or America or universities to look for people to do this. We have all the people we need here in Africa. All of them Africans who can speak these languages. And we better get on with the work and stop talking and tell the ministers. The Kwesi says that they should stop talking in circles. and get serious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pra, for the instructive, thought-provoking keynote. That's why you have elders in indigenous communities. They speak truth to power, and they shoot from the hip. I am really, really enriched, and indeed, this is how we do things at UP. We are very robust and engaging. Thank you very much. And the task is not insurmountable. Director, on Mondays I drive through in the gate, let me be welcomed by an indigenous language and say, we are Mgelegele AUP. The task is not insurmountable. Colleagues, the keynote really spoke to the fact that language carries the identity and memory of indigenous people. Intellectual fashions, we must also desist from that. We tend to move with the flow. With respect to our colleagues in the hard sciences, we hear people speak of society 5.0, but we don't even know where that society is to be applicable for our context. It's important that as universities, in as much as we strive to ensure that our graduates are to be equipped with the necessary technological innovations, but we also need to look back and be original, as Professor Pra indicated. And most importantly, look at the local context of where we are going and what we aim to do. So the example also with Afrikaans is really thought-provoking, bearing in mind that we are at the University of Pretoria. We really need to lift languages, indeed, and not speak among ourselves and be inclusive. So that's very important. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause again for our keynote. Our utlwile man. Lekwele. Nizwile ama Vice Chancellor. Hey, como fago wa Christmas. Thank you very much, Professor Pra. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we are now heading to plenary session 5, which is aiming to start now at 4:13 to 13:30. The session chair there to set the scene is Professor Madiba, who is the Dean of Humanities at Stellenbosch University. I'm handing over to you, sir, for 45 minutes to be the one who will be calling in the speakers for the session, and thereafter I'll be taking over from you at 3:15 for the tea break. Professor Madiba.
Thank you very much, Professor Maimela, for handing over the steering to me. I hope I'm not going to crash this vehicle. It's very difficult to have a session after the kind of a keynote address that we have just received. I think, Professor Kumalo, this is the last conversation. We don't want to hear of any other corporal conference that is entitled conversation. It should be work. We thank you very much, Professor Pra. We have had. So now I think we've started. it's not conversation now. I think we are going to start talking business. The theme of this conference is on resources, and there is a reason why we decided on this theme. And I think Professor Pra has just put it so well. What is the problem in this country, in South Africa? Is the problem the lack of resources? What is the problem in a country like ours that our languages, we could say they cannot be developed because there are no resources? How much resources are needed? How many billions really are we? So sometimes we speak with folk tongues. You never know. Each university will tell you that there's no resources. There are no resources. But okay, how much do we need just to develop a small word list? So I think we don't have I'm not a speaker, we don't have a problem of resources in this country. We have a problem of the allocation of resources. Universities have resources, but they've got a problem of allocation. One well-known or renowned speaker, social linguist, Joshua Fishman, he defined in 1987 what language planning is. He said, to me, language planning is authoritative allocation of resources to the attainment of language status and corpus goal, whether in connection with new functions that are aspired to, or in connection with old functions that are aspired to, or in connection with old functions that need to be discharged more adequately. So I think we have a problem of allocation. Universities have resources, but there is a problem of allocation. Our country has resources, but there is a problem of allocation. I can just imagine the 2 billions that often go to SAA, if they were to be put to languages, our languages will also fly like SAA. But as I said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not the speaker. We have 3 speakers in this session. The first speaker is Chief Mabizela, who will join us online. And then the second speaker is Professor Nokanyo Nzanga, who is here. And then I want that we change on the program there. Ms. Tuto Mashile, who is the UP SRC president, was supposed to speak, but instead of her, Mr. Tariq Lala will speak, who is also from the University of Pretoria. So that is the change that we have on the program. So let me start by introducing Mr. Chief Mabizela. I hope he's ready, he's online. He will be giving us just 15 minutes. These are just inputs. Then I hope we'll be able to have some time for discussion, to talk. I think not just talk, but also really to discuss on real actions as we are moving forward. So let me just introduce Mr. Mabizela. Mr. Mabizela is a Chief Director responsible for the Chief Directorate Higher Education Policy and Research Support in the Department of Higher Education and Training. The Chief Directorate's main responsibilities are the development and implementation of higher education policies, measurement and analysis of research and creative outputs from universities, research support, and the regulation and administration of the private higher education sector. Mr. Mabizela currently serves on the various committees. One of them is Technical Committee on Higher Education and Training, Research and Development of SADC, the Education Work Group of G20, and various BRICS higher education structures, especially when the rotational chairpersonship is under South Africa. Until recently, he was also responsible for governance in the higher education sector. Among other responsibilities, He currently serves on the boards of the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences and Higher Health. I will now hand over to Mr. Mabizela, who will give us his 15 minutes input. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Mabizela.
Thank you very much, Prof. Madiba. And good afternoon. And I shall say the phrase that I don't like much and say that all protocol observed, because I only have 15 minutes. I have been asked to give an input on providing details of the type and quantum of resources that the DHET has made available towards the implementation of the new policy framework. When I looked at this topic, I thought it's really sending me on a collision course in two ways. One, with the sector, the universities that is, and secondly, with my bosses. And I thought I will do my best to do so. But then when I looked at the program, which I only received yesterday, thought very little about it, but now following from this vibrant keynote address by Prof. Pra, I thought, this is to me now the definition of anticlimax, to have me coming after that presentation. So, Prof. Madiba, I will move quickly, and also because of that, on my presentation. In June, I was invited at a meeting of COPAL, and I did say to the colleagues at COPAL, when I presented to them the update of us implementing the policy, that I wish I was meeting them under different circumstances, and those circumstances those would be the circumstances of having had implementation plan approved as well as allocated funding. And unfortunately, that was not the case at the time. And again, as I am here today, it's a similar circumstance. And so it's a question, therefore, of almost repeating the same thing as I had presented at the meeting of COPAL in June, 6 months before. But as I have said already, I've got to be doing this presentation, and of course, maybe the confidence of the sector with us, and especially on us planning to do the implementation of the policy. So the first 3 slides or so really come directly from the policy. And so it's a matter of doing some repetition, but a necessary repetition so that we can understand each other on where we stand with the implementation of the language policy. So what we are saying in the policy is that institutions must all revise their language policies and plans to accord greater importance to indigenous African languages for purposes of teaching and learning, scholarship, communication, and administrative use. And the policies and plans must indicate strategies that the universities will adopt to promote multilingualism. And institutions are strongly encouraged, that's what the policy says, to foster trans-institutional and inter-institutional collaborations in the development and strengthening of official African languages. And the focus of such programs should be on strategies that would be adopted in higher education to achieve quality education for all students, as well as to promote multilingualism and the creation of a receptive institutional culture. So, as I said, Chair, that it's coming directly from the policy. And the institutions have been doing this work because the institutions have been inviting us to assist or to participate in their initiatives to change their policies or to redo their implementation plans on the implementation of the language policies as they have redesigned them according to the reviewed or revised language policy. New policy, by the way, it's a revised policy, and thanks to the CEO of USAF because she has put the context appropriately, that the policy in fact came first. It started in 2002, and then what we did in 2020, the revision of it, upon noticing that there was no implementation of the language policy by the institutions, especially in the affirmation of the African languages. So what we are also saying in the policy is that the national implementation plans must be reviewed annually. And so it shouldn't be just a once-off now with the introduction of the plan in line with the revised policy. And institutions are required to report annually to the department and on progress made in implementing their language policies and language development plans. And resources, what we are talking about today, and capacity to implement these policies and plans must be made available and be supported. I don't need to repeat what you have just said, Madiba, as well as Prof. Bra on this one. I think we are in agreement, and I think also I just need to confess what Prof. Bra said about being worked up, and I think that is contagious actually. So the department will establish and implement a funding model to enable the implementation of this policy framework. And the model will require universities to submit language development plans for approval by the department before funding can be made available. So this contribution that the department is committing to and committing in the policy itself. So it's not something that I've just prepared for this presentation. It's something that is there in the policy. I'm saying that to contribute because the expectation is that the institutions are carrying on with this and not waiting for the department to come with funding or resources for the implementation of the policy. So what we have done is that we have developed our own language policy implementation plan that at the beginning of the year, and remember that the official implementation of the policy was January 2022. So what we did also in March was that to develop our own plan because we need also our own guidance in terms of assisting the institutions to implement. But we have not released our plan to the sector because we need, yes, it was approved, but we also need to have the resources that we are going to be carrying along with ourselves in the implementation of the DHET's implementation plan. But it doesn't therefore mean, as I have said already, that the institutions should be waiting for the department to come with that bag of resources to them. So our plan represents the guidelines on how the language policy framework will be implemented by the DHET. And the aim is to lay a foundation and provide support to all the 26 universities to commence or accelerate development initiatives of the historically marginalized and underdeveloped indigenous languages in academia, including the Khoi, Nama, and San language, as well as the sign language. So that's a mouthful, but I thought let me read all of that point because it's actually fundamental on the purpose of the revision of the policy, as well as fundamental in terms of the core aim of the policy, as to what we are projecting or wanting to have the sector focusing on. And the purpose is to lay a foundation and provide support for all the universities to commence or accelerate their language development initiatives and to provide base funding support. And it's the funding that will be, in terms of our plan, will be funding that at least will be taking the institutions for 3 years and possibly with a revision after that and see is a need again to continue for another 3 years or so. And the DHET plan will suggest, among others, that institutional plans outline the status of indigenous languages within the university. I see the next session is focusing on reported In fact, it's one of the issues I was feeling that I wish I could be talking after that session. And the official languages of teaching and learning, the languages adopted by the University for Academic Development, official communication and measures of initiatives to be undertaken by the university to promote indigenous languages. That would be part of the strategy and not just a plan as to by when should we be having this, but a strategy that the institution will be adopting to roll out the implementation of their policies. The specific activities, projects, and programs, and must have a clear budget outline, time frames, as well as annual performance targets. And that is what we are going to be requesting from the institutions when we are ready with this, as the euphemism goes today. And then what we are then saying is that upon approval of our plan with the budget that is, the DHET will establish an advisory panel of language and policy experts to assist with the evaluation of the plan and advise the DHET on acceptability and so on. Now, this is my last slide, Chair. So the proposal, I hope you were not expecting me to say that this is how much that the department is bringing. And that's exactly what I was saying, that I was feeling that I'm being put on a collision course here. And the proposal is that the implementation plan be funded through the University Capacity Development Grant, which I think, if not all of you, but most of you would be aware of by now, because that program, or that, yes, it is a program, but there are many initiatives within the program. Of course, it comes with a grant, and that the grant will assist, therefore, with the rollout of the implementation plan. And each institution will then receive the same amount of funds to cover a period of 3 years. That is, in terms of equity across the institutions, that the same amount, but of course on approval of the plan. And that approval really is not a matter of ticking that, this is a plan that's correct and this one is incorrect, but it's a question of taking along an institution to a point where that the experts in the panel will feel comfortable that the institution indeed has got an implementable plan and a plan that yield the results. And additional funds be made available. So over and above the funds that to cover each institution for the next 3 years, let's say, additional funds be made available to institutions that include or focus specifically on the Khoi, Nama, and the sign language. Because in our understanding, at least on the Khoi, Nama, and sign languages, is that there are no institutions currently that are paying attention to them or focusing on them, as well as that those languages are, maybe if you can put them on a scale of the indigenous languages, would be at the bottom of that scale. So funding to consider favorably inter-institutional and regional collaborations. My first slide has shown that this is based on what we are intending the policy, and that the universities to submit annual progress reports, which the DHET, with advice from the advisory panel, will analyze for monitoring, further improvements on implementation, improvements on the policy, and any other thing really that the data, because this will be some sort of empirical data coming up from the institutions on, especially on the affirmation and improvement of academic use of the indigenous languages. So that is my say for now. And I'm sure, as I have said, at least to soften the blow, I had to do the presentation, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to promise you how much. Yes, we have submitted how much we require from the department. We will depend on the level of that money. So I'm not at liberty to say or disclose at the moment how much we have applied for. It will be a question of disclosing that once we get the approval. Thank you so much, Prof.
No, thanks so much, Mr. Mabizela, for your presentation. Can we give him a hand of applause? So I think what we'll do, we'll go through the speakers. So I hope you'll be able to stay on, Mr. Mabizela, for questions at the end of this session.
Yes, Prof. Yes.
Okay. So let's move to the next speaker, Professor Colloquium Mzanga, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Nelson Mandela University. Her research focuses on multilingualism and preparations of teachers for multilingual classroom contexts. In her teaching, she's particularly focused on teaching Xhosa and English to English and or Afrikaans student teachers. She has published articles and book chapters on language-related issues. She's an external examiner for several higher education institutions and supervisors of honors, masters, and doctoral students. She has presented her work at both national and international conferences and peer reviews articles for several accredited journals. She is currently a deputy chairperson of COPAL. Her community engagement projects focus on training parents of children with autism to design learning resources and activities to support their children's learning at home. She is a self-publishing author of the book Seems Like It Is My Destiny. In this book, she outlines her journey of raising a child with autism. Thank you very much. Over to you.
All right, Vice Chancellors, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Doc, CEO of USAF, Chair of COPAL, members of COPAL, student leadership, colleagues, Molweni. We are supposed to engage. Molweni. Ninjani. Siyaphila. Diyaphila. It's quite interesting that I'm going to talk about challenges confronting universities in the implementation of the new language policy framework after listening to the keynote address, because what he raised was, what challenges? Do we really have challenges? And then also after listening to Chief Mabizela saying that there is funding, so which means we don't have funding challenge. So as I was sitting there, I was actually asking myself, can't I change this? You know, instead of having a presentation, then we might as well talk about the challenges. What challenges do you really have in your institutions? But then maybe it's something that we will discuss later on. And I'm glad that I did my presentation in a question format so that everybody then can eventually come up with an answer to the question. So I'll just remind us of the key aspects of the language policy framework and look into the domains of language policy implementation to establish whether there are challenges in that regard and what still needs to be addressed, if there is any, and then questions highlighting the challenges in implementation. And I'm a member of COPAL, which is the Community of Practice for the Teaching of African Languages. And I think from our discussions in the past, since 2016, you know, there are a lot of things that COPAL would really like to see as a way forward. So I will quickly brief on that. If you look at the language policy framework, it does highlight that one of the challenges that we have is actually the underdevelopment and underutilization of official African languages at higher education institutions. And secondly, it speaks about the fact that it is mentioned that we need to promote multilingualism as a strategy to facilitate meaningful access and participation. For me, it suggests that it is a challenge or it's something that is not yet done. You know, so I would like us to look into those two as we're thinking about the challenges that we might be experiencing in our institution. At the same time, when I looked into the various, you know, language policy frameworks of various universities, I realized that it appears that this is the focus of what we are currently doing as we are developing, you know, or revising our language policies and also developing the implementation plans. So when I looked throughout our university policies and implementation plans, I realized that from each university, there is a mention of a time frame in terms of what our short-term goals, medium-term goals, or long-term goals. Now the question is, if we're thinking of challenges, do we as universities feel that there are issues that need to be addressed in as far as the timeframes are concerned? We just heard from Mr. Bizela that, these policies need to be revised annually. Now I'm looking in terms of the plan and the implementation plan that we already have in place. Now, how do you then think about the timeframes in relation to the annual revision of these policies? So colleagues, as I said, I'm just going to pose these questions back to you, just for something to think about. And then I noticed that there's a part on the operational capacity. So in our institutions, where is this language policy actually housed? Is it in the Faculty of Humanities, or do universities have directorates that deal specifically with the issues of language policy? So where is the challenge there? Is there any visibility? For instance, if anyone could go to my institution, I see and acknowledge my colleagues there, the back, Dr. Lek and Dr. van der Merwe. If anyone were to come to our institution and speak to anyone in the passage, will they be able to respond and say, yes, we do have a revised language policy, and we have been part of that language policy? It's a rhetorical question, and I think it applies to all of us. And when it comes to, we all talk about a language policy that will address communication with public, like having this multilinguality being visible in as far as communication in our institutions, the language of university documents, our websites, language of learning and teaching, learning, teaching and assessment, research, innovation, community engagement, the naming of buildings, and so forth. So if this is what is common in what we have already documented so far as what we want to focus on, what then do we see as challenges going forward? And it was quite interesting for me when I just looked at, but I'll just mention a few studies here. When I looked at your study, Prof. Hlongwa, that you did some years back, and the moment you started engaging with the community about what you are doing at UKZN, there was controversy. There was a lot of, backslash, and there were a lot of challenges there. And then I started asking myself, in other institutions, have we really engaged with our communities to say, listen, we want to have a revised language policy that promotes official African languages and multilingualism, and what has been the response of the communities? Because as universities, we can't operate in solo. We are part of the community. And I was also thinking, I'm a teacher by profession, I'm in the Faculty of Education. And what is currently happening here, we prepare teachers, to teach using multilingual strategies. When they go to schools, they are told that the policy that we're still following, which is the 1997 one, Language and Education Policy, gives power to the SGPs to determine the language policy of the schools, which is not an African language. And then you find that there is no conversation between us and the Department of Basic Education in as far as this is concerned. Now my question is, if this is what we are doing, are we doing it alone, or are we doing it with the rest of the community? Because we also mentioned that what we do at the university, in addition to teaching and learning and research, is community engagement. What communities are we engaging with? And how are we engaging with the communities in as far as this language policy is concerned? And then also it was interesting that, a study that was done in Bangladesh, where there was a realization that we can't talk of a language policy without thinking about the social needs of the people in the community, and what is the relationship between language policy and the societal needs, and what is the view of the society in as far as the use of African languages in institutions of higher learning. I think we just need to adopt the pedagogy of truth. At some stage, we just need to be very truthful about these issues, because theorizing everything and not being able to ensure that, it's really implementable in a way that the community as well does benefit. It's quite challenging. And of course, with Karinga's research, some of the issues were the influence of globalization, the fact that internet, every information is it's less in African languages, the unavailability of resources, but we hear from this colloquium that we do have resources, non-monitoring of implementation, and I hope it's not going to be the same with us, and the resistance from parents. And I'm wondering how the parents of the students that we are teaching actually feel about this, if we engage them, and the mother tongue as the language of learning and teaching in schools. Now, I don't know why this came out so small, but at this point in time, I was just wondering if this is the conversation of the past, or it is still a conversation that we are facing in our institutions as we're thinking about the challenges, or maybe we don't have challenges. In most studies, you'll hear people talk about language as a social justice issue. What does it mean? Is that the lens that we are using in our revision of the language policy? And how do we, think about social justice? Are we doing, or are we revising these policies because of the conviction on social justice issue, especially when the proponents are highlighting the concepts of equity, fairness, and equality? And if we're talking of social justice, obviously there is a notion of change, action and change, which I think it's what this forum or this colloquium wants to see. And I also wondered if staff and students, that is both the academic and support staff, are still questioning, or do they still need to question the historical language circumstances in order to inform the language policy? I remember when we were busy with developing the revised language policy in my institution at Nelson Mandela, we actually involved everyone, from the gardener to the cleaner, to say what are your language experiences in this institution, because we wanted their voices to inform the revised language policy so that everybody is included and feels, visible and seen, because we are avoiding a situation where a certain group of people are the ones who are actually working on their revisions. So is it a challenge then if we question, those language circumstances and how our own experiences in the institutions actually inform how we think about the language policy? Is it a conversation of the past, or is it still a challenge where we still have to question the hegemonies that promote singular and exclusive epistemologies which deny different forms of knowing, meaning making, viewing, and explaining the world? Are we still there, or we have moved forward now? We are focusing on the resources and the funding. We no longer talk about these conversations. And also, what about the political history of our universities and their institutional identities? How do we assist in the evolution and the change? Or I will keep on repeating the same. Is that the conversation of the past? Is it a challenge in our moving forward? We have the answers. And what about the fact that we can still argue that we can use African languages to demystify ideologies, power relations, and struggling, legitimate means of access to knowledge, opportunities, resources? Are we there yet, or are we still looking at English as the only language that can serve that function? And what about the concept of multilingualism? Are there any ideologies in multilingualism? What does it mean? Are we still challenged with that, or these are the conversations of the past? So I would like us, as we are thinking in our deliberations, to think about these questions, to say, do we still converse about these? Are these the barriers that make us not to move forward? Because for me, it can, yes, be lack of determination, it could be funding, it could be resources. But the question is, do we still have some underlying issues that are internal in our different institutions? Right, so then how do we address the belief that African languages do not have a pedagogical and market value and therefore do not contribute to the economy of the country? Is that still a belief? Or we have addressed it and we have proof and evidence that African languages do have market value and do contribute to the economy of the country? And how do we then ensure that not only DHET, but international aid agencies and local business fund projects towards the development and implementation of a multilingual language policy? And as I asked earlier, is multilingualism a dominant ideology? How do we ensure it doesn't reproduce inequality amongst the official African languages themselves? At the same time, how do we ensure that university community understands the complexity of language policy and implementation issues? And how do we find ways of managing the complexity? And how far are we in as far as our psychological readiness with regard to official African languages as enablers to student access, success, and support? It's one thing to theorize it, it's another to actually implement it. And so these are the questions that I would like us to look into. And as COPAL, I think I was able to pick up some. I've already mentioned the conversation with DBE and also the UCDG funding that can be available, ensuring that in the university discussions, the vision and strategic plans, the issue of language policy is mentioned. And we can't talk about multilingualism and development of African languages without thinking about increasing the number of lecturers who can operate in a multilingual context and so forth. So in talking about this, for me, this picture actually represents the process, the journey itself. We can see where we're going, but then along the ways, there might be some challenges, which I think it's only us in this colloquium that can debate those challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Msanga. I wish the road was as smooth as that one. So we are now going to listen to Mr. Tariq Lala. The short bio is that Mr. Tariq Lala is the SRC Secretary of University of Pretoria, and he is currently pursuing his BSc Honours in Ecology. So I will hand over to him. Just have 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay.
I was actually told 5 minutes, so 10 minutes is a bit of a... I feel like I was...
More to students.
I think that I was promised 10 minutes. I'm going to try and use that as best as I can now. No, as pointed out, I am Nobala Obafundi at the University of Pretoria, the Secretary General of the Student Representative Council. And so just before I begin, I'd like to contextualize sort of my frame of reference when I'm presenting this. So before I was an elected student leader, I was a student activist, and so in representing my constituency or our constituency, my frame of reference is always going to be progressive student activism. And I'd like to begin by first pointing out the fact that it's just very interesting that we are having this discussion on multilingualism and the introduction of or at least the language policy framework, and it's happening at the University of Pretoria, which was effectively the center of the Afrikaans Must Fall movement in 2015. And the reason that I bring this up is because that movement, again, from my perspective, sought to do exactly what we are speaking about here, which is effectively remove language as a barrier of access to institutions of higher learning and higher education at large. And whilst I acknowledge the paradox that the Afrikaans Must Fall movement had in pushing for English as a sole medium of engagement, I would also like to reframe it for purposes of this discussion, which is to say that the Afrikaans Must Fall movement did not stop or was not the endpoint for transformation within the context of language at universities, but rather it was the start. And the reason that I say this is because when we speak about language within higher education, especially within historically wide institutions such as the University of Pretoria, what we see is that Afrikaans has been a language that has been used to prevent access to higher education. And so in saying that then, or in that sense at least, as students and as student leaders, we have to agree and welcome the introduction of multilingualism as a subsequent step to the removal of exclusive practices within the institution, which is not to say that the language of Afrikaans is exclusive or has the potential to be exclusive in the future. But in saying that, when we say we welcome the introduction of multilingualism, and more specifically the intention of the policy framework, there are a few reservations that I, as a student leader, as a student, as people, as someone who interacts with students have. And a lot of that lies in the implementation of the framework. So, in as much as we can speak about the benefits or the benefits of multilingualism, we must equally acknowledge that there is a space for, I want to say, abuse of that discussion. And I say that within the, or at least I say that or knowing very well that there is effectively a monopoly on multilingualism. What I mean is that within discussions of multilingualism, especially again at historically wide institutions, and I say this speaking anecdotally, is that when those discussions of multilingualism happen, it's always English, Afrikaans, and another language that needs to be introduced. Now that can't be multilingualism if we're saying we're reintroducing Afrikaans as or to push a multilingual agenda. And so that's why I'm saying the reservation that I as a student leader have is effectively that we are going to, or this has the potential to cause or to take us back in as much as it has the potential to take us forward. So when I say that, I also want to outline the fact that there is potential for tokenism within that space or within that discussion. The fact is that if we are saying that English and Afrikaans are going to be reintroduced within multiple universities across South Africa, and then we're going to have Sepedi or isiZulu or isiXhosa in various universities, those languages are effectively tokens to speak about transformation rather than transforming itself. So it's not contributing to the culture of that institution, but rather an addition to an existing culture. So in saying that, the other thing that I've long maintained and that we've long maintained as student leaders, student activists, is that we can only introduce, or subsequently we can only introduce well-developed academic languages such as English and Afrikaans once other languages have been developed. And so it speaks to the time frame of what we are speaking about here. The reality is that we cannot have English and Afrikaans being introduced alongside Sepedi or isiZulu as it is today, given the fact that, again, the 2015 report had outlined the fact that there had been little development in African languages. And so we need to, from my perspective, at least from my understanding, my question is then, what have we done since 2015 to say that those languages have been developed and subsequently we can introduce multilingualism with all languages being at the same level? So again, our reservation comes in, or at least the recommendation from here is that Afrikaans and English can only be, or at least for now, Afrikaans can only be reintroduced once our African languages have been developed, and not to develop as they are being used, because then we are effectively setting ourselves up for failure. The last discussion point that I'd like to raise, and I think it's quite characteristic of a lot of student leaders, is that these discussions cannot be limited to academic spaces. So the fact of the matter is that it cannot be that there's a single student, no matter the caliber of that student, to present the perspective of students within a discussion, given the fact that we are well aware that the South African student body is heterogeneous and has a wide range of views and ideas, especially in relation to language. And so those discussions need to exist both in academic spaces, well, not both, but academic spaces, spaces of governance, and spaces where students are. There cannot be decisions for students without students being present. It's again, setting up the policy or setting up the discussion for failure. And so the one thing that I'd like to just then conclude is that the reality is that these discussions are always characterized by identifying problems very easily, but providing very few solutions. And I say this again as a student leader who does that quite often, is that it's very easy to identify the problems. And so in saying that, I do look forward to the discussions that are going to be happening here, specifically around the implementation of the policy, albeit in the absence of large groups of students. Nevertheless, we welcome the intention of the policy, which is to say multilingualism, and we look forward to the discussions that are going to be happening from this point onwards in order to create a more diverse, inclusive space within our institutions of higher learning. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lala, for your presentation. We had 3 presentations. So the program director has agreed to give us at least 10 minutes for question and answer. So I will ask people to ask questions briefly, and those who answer them also to do the same. The first speaker language policy implementation always involves various stakeholders. So I think the first speaker, Mr. Mabizela, was really representing government as the main body, and then Professor Mzanga, institutions of higher education, and then we have students as our stakeholders. So I think this is it's a very, very important session. So I will open for questions. We'll really encourage you to ask questions if you are here. There are 2 roving mics. You can raise up your hand, then the mic will come to you, and then you ask a question. And those who are online, we are also encouraging you. You can post your question on the site, or you can also just really, tell us that, ask the question directly. So I see there's a hand at the back there. There are 2 hands. Okay, I noted that hand and this hand. Okay. You can introduce yourself and so that we know who you are.
Thank you very much, Prof. Madiba. I'm Nobuhle Shongwa from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I have a question for Chief Mabizela. You mentioned the port, which is UCDG funding. Would you please explain if there isn't currently a cut in that funding as we speak? I'm a little bit worried about it because that's the funding that we'll be tapping into. So if we could have clarity on that one. Secretary General, thank you very much. Thank you very much. This one, Chair, is not a question, but a comment. This will depend on how you view multilingualism. It's either you view multilingualism as a resource or you view multilingualism as a problem. So I will just end there. I don't want to explain because I think from the keynote address from Professor Kwesi Pra, he made this clear, so I don't want to disturb the wise word from Professor Kwesi Pra, but either you look at it as a resource or as a problem, and then we take it from there. Thank you very much.
Okay, can I take a few questions so that I can move? Yeah, you are next. So, no, okay, you can go ahead and then you will come next and then you.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. Lochani. Nangithi lochani ngiphendule nithi akwande. Lochani. Ahake yezwakala bakwethu. Yeah, Imbala, this is colloquium focusing on African languages. My first question, Chairperson.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is William Chiana.
William.
Member of COPAL.
Okay.
And also, I'm from the University of Mpumalanga.
No, it's fine. That's the question.
Thank you very much. My question is on the Chief Director, Mr. Mabizela, to say the UCDP funding, when it was initially planned by the ministry, did they have in mind the implementation of the national language policy framework, or it was just a matter that came now after the final draft was done a few years back? Secondly, Prof. Mzanga, in one of the challenges, I think that we are having, looking at the issue of leadership in our institutions. The first question I may be having now is, how many VCs do we have in here? I know, or maybe we have 26 universities.
Just give us the question.
What is your idea regarding the issue of leadership and its influence
Okay.
in ensuring that these language policies are developed and implemented. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's just go to the question, no greetings, please, okay?
Thank you. My name is George.
George, okay?
In my previous life, I worked in a medical facility, and one of the things in a medical school, one of the things that was brought up during the change of the curriculum was the issue of language. They could not develop more than perhaps half a semester course in an African language because they said the curriculum is full, there is no space. I would like Professor Matsanga perhaps to help us to think about that when they say, well, we would like to teach African languages, but we have no time. The rest of the time has to focus on what medical students have to learn. Thank you.
Okay, so I think the question at the back.
Can I go first as I have the
Okay,
mic?
oh, you are the first, okay.
Just quickly, I'm Alexa. I am from the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and I just want to commend Tariq for speaking on behalf of students, and I do regret that we do not have more students here. And I want to emphasize what Prof. Pra said, that languages do not respect colonial boundaries. And we must be careful that excluding Afrikaans, though it has colonial imprints, might also exclude speakers of Afrikaans who do not associate with those who are also oppressed. That is it.
Okay, so that is directed to Lala, I think. You have currency, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Julius Jabba Futantile. Mine is just a question, adding to the key points that Professor Nzanga has raised, especially in relation to the multilingualism ideologies. And I want to take this August House to clause 29 of this policy that you are sitting with here. And I want you to ponder.
Yeah, but I just need the question because
yes,
really we need
I'm
questions.
coming to the question.
Yeah.
Now, because if we are not going to be as specific in terms of what we are saying, then we are not going to be clear. In that clause, there's a point that says English is a de facto language.
Okay.
Which is problematic and unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Number one.
Yeah.
Number two, it goes to say that learners whose English is not their mother tongue must be provided with necessary support. Again, we are going back to academic English for academic purposes.
Yeah.
When we arrived at universities. And now they are being forced by these particular policies, while the policies should be promoting African languages. The last point, which is problematic, and this August House has not yet mentioned it, in the same clause, is that the necessary support must be provided to students whom English is not their first language or mother tongue. And there's a disturbing part that is not being raised since this policy has been promulgated in order to ensure academic success. So the academic success of a black child in Africa is dependent in English.
Okay.
That is the question that I want you to deal with. Thank you.
I got your point. Okay, thank you so much. So I think now we will just pause here because the question, we will not be able to cover all the questions. Now, let me just take this round so that we see if we still have I was only given 10 minutes and that has expired. So I think the first one, Chief Mabizela, I think you mentioned the issue of UCDG, and I think that is a bit confusing. You know, what is the part of, we know that UCDG has been happening, has been there, it's been allocated, Are you saying that now there's going to be an allocation, additional allocation for language policy, or university have to cut, I think, on that one? I think that's what you are saying, Professor Chong. Where will that fund for language policy come from? Mr. Mabizela?
Thanks for that question. And it covers also, I will cover the second question as well, that about the UCDG, whether this was planned when the UCDG was established. Yes, the allocation would come as a separate allocation, not as part of what institutions are currently receiving. So I think that will be clear. But then what we are then also saying is that, you know, we had planned the UCDG or UCDP. In fact, that's the reason why I emphasize on the University Capacity Development Program, because there are a number of initiatives within the program, a number of sub-programs, if you like, and then funded. And part of that, you know, we've got a fund under the UCDP that is meant for flexibility, if you like, but it's mainly that flexibility is on collaborative programs. And this would be under the collaborative programs, and not necessarily as a definition of collaboration between institutions, but as as I say, flexible program to fund programs of this nature that are across the institutions. The collaborative part is just the terminology that we are using for it. So there is catering for it, but not necessarily in terms of the actual funding. The allocation of funding will come once we have the approval of the funds, that is. I hope that is clear, Prof. Motiba.
Okay, no, thanks. Can you also take Julia's question on certain clauses in the policy framework, which seems to be undermining for example, you know, English is de facto language, the support only for those students who are not, for whom English is not the mother tongue. So I think that's Julia's question, that is the policy framed in a manner that is conducive for the promotion of multilingualism or not?
Yes, thanks, Chair. You know, we call this a language, we call it policy framework. You know, it's a framework that with then the expectation, or by design, the expectation is that the institutions then come with their policies, that they align those policies with the framework. Now, one of the reasons for that, Prof, is that we are dependent on the experts for the implementation of this policy, as well as, you know, the understanding of what needs to be done for us to achieve what we would like to achieve. And in this case, it's a simple achievement of having our indigenous African languages, or the historically marginalized languages, being affirmed, you know, languages of academia. So that is the idea. So when there is a critique of the policy or the policy framework, it's well and good, because that's exactly the intention, that the experts come and assist us understanding as well as the implementation of the policy. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with the colleagues or the academics or the experts pointing out at something that needs to be done still with the policy. And we hope, of course, that's exactly the reason why I said earlier on, we hope that the panel that we will put together to assist us with the implementation of the policy, because it's going to be the panel of experts. And I want to also touch on the comment by Prof. Mtanga, that it will also, our intention is always to include DBE. We have always done that in the development of the policy, including PANSAL. We also want to do that in the implementation. And it's not just a question of ticking the box and having DBE with us, but it's also these discussions with DBE in terms of what then needs to be done from the information that we are getting with the implementation of the policy, so that then the experts come in and advise us on the policy, advise us on the implementation. So that's how I can answer the question from Julia's chair. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Then there are a few questions on curriculum. I think these really are directed to you, Professor Mzanga. And then there's also a question of leadership. I don't know who will take that, Professor Langa. Why some of the VCs are not here? Did you get the apologies or nominees? You know. So can we just handle the issue of the curriculum? And I think it's a bit of a problem. This health sciences program, maybe one semester. You got the questions. I think you can briefly, yeah. Yeah.
He knows, because he's part of COPAL, that when we initiated the Vice Chancellor's Colloquium, the point was because we believed that leadership is key in this process. So I don't know how you feel, but when we started off last year, I mean, there was visibility of Vice Chancellors and representatives as well. And Prof. Langa will also, add to that as to, the number of VCs that we have at the moment. But if you look in our program for the next 2 days, you can see that there are VCs that have, agreed to actually participate. And I want to believe that they do support what we are doing. And definitely, we do have a buy-in from our institutions. So when it comes to the question of curriculum, I mean, it's very key. Because as it is now, I know some of us are not only teaching languages, but we teach, in my case, and Dr. Klangetwa, education as well. You can see that, the curriculum is still rooted in Eurocentric views. And it is a challenge, and it's something that we really need to be working on, because there is a relationship between the development of the language policy to multilingualism and curriculum development as well, even within the languages themselves. For instance, I know in the literature there is the talk of the first language, the second language, additional language, and the question is, are these languages separate? Do you acquire them separately? Are they separate entities or bounded entities? So those are some of the issues that still need to be clarified in the curriculum. So yes, I agree, there is a challenge there. Thank you.
So thank you, colleagues. I just want us to finish now with the student questions that has to do with students. There are two questions directed to Lala. Well, I think the issue, you mentioned the issue of Africans. I think you picked that question. And I think people really wants to, there were just a general comment made. Now, I've also have one question here. How will we marry the internationalization agenda and the multilingual indigenous language agenda? How will we prepare students for the international world if they are only taught in their indigenous languages? So I think those are the questions that, I mean, I think you raise more questions about this, but I think there are 4 more questions, and I think Professor Mzanga or the question that also Professor Shongwa tried to answer, but in a form of question again. So I think the issue of students really we really need to talk about, because they are very important stakeholders in this situation. You can again restate your view.
Yes, no, so, I mean, so there were a few comments that were raised specifically to what I said, and obviously I'm thankful for that, because then at least we can interact on that. The point that I do want to clarify, and I think I absolutely agree with the idea that there are many students who, for example, may speak Afrikaans as a home language, who come from, or who are people of color, communities that were previously marginalized, or whatever the case is. And so I completely acknowledge that, however, the realities on the ground, again, I completely acknowledge that I'm also speaking anecdotally. So it's about the perspective of students. And I say this as somebody, again, my frame of reference is within the, student activism. And so the way, at least I've experienced it on the ground, students have experienced it at universities is that more often than not, even students who are previously, who are from previously disadvantaged communities, whilst they may speak Afrikaans, with these institutions, that the use of Afrikaans still benefits students, especially in terms of within academic and teaching and learning activities, still benefits students from previously advantaged communities. And so it is difficult. Nobody's denying that it's difficult, and it's tricky to find that compromise. But equally, I think first and foremost, we would need to be able to be frank. And I think the only way we can have those discussions, like it was mentioned, is that if there are students in the room. And only through engaging with the heterogeneous or with the entire spectrum of views within the student community and the student body nationally will we be able to deliberate and find a resolution. And so it feels, at that point, it won't feel like, it's academics and governance imposing their views onto students. The question about international, or at least indigenous languages within an international context, my perspective there is that it goes back to what was being said earlier is, okay, but why do we not respect our own languages first and foremost? And so the fact of the matter is that the only reason we consider certain languages international is because they were imposed onto us. Now, I'm not advocating for us to go and impose our languages onto everyone else, but what I'm saying is that we need to acknowledge that within our own context, our languages are just as relevant. And in saying that, why should it be that, for example, when people when international, multinational corporations or international governments, or whatever the case is, are interacting with South Africa, why is it that they are interacting in English, a language that was brought here and imposed onto our people? Why are we not respecting our own languages first and foremost? And I say that as a student who feels like there has not been enough opportunity for us to engage with our own languages. But I do think that was most of what was raised. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Unfortunately, we have completely run out of time. We are behind the program now. So I think we have had what the plans from government in terms of resourcing. We have had the challenges that really academics are reflecting, ideological issues of policies, how do we understand policy, how do we understand the language concepts and so on, so which are more ideological problems and so on. So these are issues that academics wrestle with all the time, and trying to see what can be decolonized, if we still want to use that term, but I think after Professor Pra has spoken, maybe it will go out of our vocabulary, but we have also heard the voice from the students. So with students, really, I always regard this as the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is, they want the issue of Africans on the one hand. We don't want Africans to be privileged. But at the same time, we know that our students are not good in English. English is unattainable. I mean, it's unassailable. It is important, but it's unassailable. It's unassailable, but it's unattainable. So we know that our black students are failing in large numbers, lagging behind, even behind the African-speaking students who can use both English and Afrikaans. But it's a conference, it's a discussion that we really need to enter into, to engage in with the students. So I think, colleagues, can we just give the speakers a hand of applause? And again, I think I will be going back again with apology to Professor Maimela.
Thank you very much, Professor Madiba. Hashtag language colloquium at UP, it's hot. Yes, that's where we are. Colleagues, we will then start with taking a group photo for those who are in the Senate Hall. Just for 5 minutes, we'll be handing over to the team, and those colleagues who are joining us virtually, you would also have an opportunity to stretch your legs while we take the photo and while we break for the afternoon tea. We have eaten more time, and I've allowed that deliberately, of the cocktail, because we are not here for the cocktail. So we'll spend less time at the cocktail and more in the Senate Hall. And that budget, we reroute it to deal with the language policy. It's very important, colleagues. It was deliberate, Professor Madiba, what I've done. So the supplier, that side, we must inform the supplier that the allocated budget will be reduced. I don't know if it will remain with us at UP or where, but it must do something there. So colleagues, we will then, after the photo in the Senate, and then colleagues also online, you will resume the program again exactly at 4 o'clock. Thank you, colleagues. Over to you, colleagues. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the third session of today's deliberations on the VC's Colloquium Drive, which we are co-hosting as the University of Pretoria with USAF. To colleagues joining us online as well, warm welcome to you. Colleagues, we are now entering the plenary session 6 and 7, which will deal with the sector-wide language resources audit report. The first speaker who will introduce this session is Professor Dion Komo, who is NRF Sachi Chair at Rhodes University, and he will be introducing the discussion on the sector-wide language resources audit report. In brief, Professor Nkomo is an Associate Professor of African Language Studies at the School of Languages and Literatures at Rhodes University. He is also the NRF Sachi Chair for Intellectualization of African Languages, Multilingualism and Education. Sachi chairs are very difficult people in universities. He holds a BA Honours with distinction in African Languages from the University of Zimbabwe, an MPhil cum laude, lexicography, and a PhD in lexicography from Stellenbosch University, as well as a postgraduate diploma in higher education from Rhodes University. His areas of academic interest include language planning and policy, multilingualism, language teaching, lexicography, translation, terminology, and higher education studies. He's an NRF-rated scholar, C2, and one of the editors of Lexicos, the Journal of the African Association for Lexicography. Welcome, Professor Nkomo.
Molweni, ninjani, Dikon. I think I have the easiest of the tasks in this program. It's not as difficult as chairpersons of important events such as this colloquium. Thank you very much, Prof. My role is to introduce an issue, an important topic in the work of COPAL and indeed in the work of trying to implement our language policies in our institutions, the issue of resources. And I need to clarify here, Prof. Pra is already gone. I'm not talking about resources in terms of money, but the resources that can actually help, be it our students, be it stakeholders within our institutions or communities at large, to use their languages effectively as resources. I would just draw just a bit from the early years of language planning as a discipline. One of the most important activities in language planning identified at the very earliest days of the discipline in the 1960s is fact-finding. It is so easy, you know, with language planning and policy because at policy level, we are talking politics, language politics. But when we look at how languages are used and how they should be used, we are now talking about languages as tools and resources. So maybe instead of making sometimes broad, emotional, and in some cases anecdotal statements, such as it is difficult to use African languages because they don't have resources. It is therefore important that we embark on a fact-finding mission. And this is exactly what this sector-wide audit in terms of multilingual resources or resources in African languages was all about. The idea is that as we try to ensure that we align our language policies, our language policy implementation plans at our different universities, we need to know clearly, unequivocally, what resources are available in our different institutions. We need to know what resources we need to produce in order to ensure that our languages can serve as efficient resources in our different endeavors, be they our academic projects or our endeavor to transform our institutional cultures. So this is what we should expect from this session, where Professor Langakumalo and Johan Stein are going to present the report, which I understand is still at the preliminary stages. Work is still ongoing. And then I believe that once that task is completed, we'll be able to know exactly what resources we need to develop and what resources we can get from our partners within the sector, because one of the challenges, besides just saying we don't have resources, has been the duplication of efforts and embarking on wasteful expenditures, as Professor Pra alluded. So on that note, delegates in the House and those online, I'll make way for our important presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Right, so as part of the presentation this afternoon, we really want to focus on this idea of multilingualism as a vehicle to unlock access to knowledge in the higher education sector. Okay, there we go. In the presentation, I will cover the following aspects: introduction in terms of how we got to this point, how we developed the instrument that was used as part of the audit, our progress to date, preliminary feedback, and then also reflecting on a way forward, especially given the very informative talks that we have received today. So in terms of the introduction, as was mentioned quite a few times today, where the first colloquium focused very much on the strategic importance of the policy and what the requirements of the policy is, this colloquium is starting to think about towards implementing the policy. And this is also what this presentation points towards: what are the certain success factors that must be taken into account if we want to successfully implement this policy. And this is also where the audit comes in specifically. In terms of the commissioned audit, it was commissioned by USAF, and it focused on three main areas. The first one is to define the range of resources that are required for the successful implementation of a language policy framework, identify the resources that's available at an institution to enable the implementation of such a framework, and then also to identify the milestones or the successes that really points towards a successful implementation of a language policy framework. When you break this down, it can really be broken down into three simple things in terms of what is there, what is available at your institution, what is missing at your institution, and then what milestones can be celebrated. And when we know these things, we can really start to model a way of how institutional resources and knowledge can also be there to enable the whole sector to move forward and benefit the entire sector. In terms of the development of the instrument and the approach that was followed, we started in April this year, and we identified that pilots were definitely needed in order to successfully complete this audit. And then subsequently a questionnaire was started for development. We specifically focused, and now it's so regrettable that our student representative is not here, but we specifically focused on developing both a student and a staff and management questionnaire, because that is very different perspectives that can be brought into the conversation. The questionnaire was finalized early July, and then we also, shortly after that, received the endorsement from USAF to formally start with the audit process. In terms of piloting institutions, we started at the Northwest University as well as University of KwaZulu-Natal, and that is where we piloted the questionnaire as well as the structure of the site visits. We centered in the end for a structure that allows for engagement with management and staff, and that support staff as well as academic staff during the morning sessions. And then in the afternoon, we have a session specifically with students to also focus on the perspectives that they bring to the whole discussion. The questionnaires was then also piloted, and that allowed for very broad input and feedback by colleagues who were present at the pilots. Now, progress to date, our site visits. This is a picture that we start our site visits with, and that really, in a way, paints the picture of different voices, different ideas, and different approaches that's needed to take us forward in this, in this area. It's not just a one-size-fits-all, and we really need the different perspectives in order to move forward towards the implementation of the policy. Our first university, where we formally started, was at the University of Mpumalanga. It was very nice to be hosted in their new hotel school. It's really, really great facilities, and we were able to conduct the audit there with them, with their management, their staff, and their students on the 4th of November, 2022. Then subsequently, we also visited the Vaal University of Technology on the 22nd of November, and most recently, we were able to visit the University of South Africa, UNISA, on the 28th of November. So some of the challenges that we've experienced with the audit specifically was around dates, setting dates. At the end of the year, most universities are busy with end-of-year examinations, and we will also start further engagements with the rest of the sector to ensure that we are able to finish the audit in time in the next 6 months. One thing that really did work well is the designated contact that was provided by the VCs to USAF, because it really helps streamline communication as well as engagement before the particular site visits. So one of the things, if we reflect on the site visits that we've conducted, is that it is natural that discussions can become passionate. Discussions are in a way sensitive in nature because language is such a personal thing. But it is also something that we've seen that it can sometimes tend towards focusing really on what is missing, what is really challenges at an institution. And what we can say from our visits is it's very clear that there's a lot of work that has taken place at university. There's a lot of resources available. And this is not, like we said earlier, or the chair mentioned, it's not just financial resources. There's a lot of expertise, there's data sets, there's glossaries. There is a lot of resources available. And I think most importantly is what we picked up, there's definitely the will and the energy towards implementing this policy framework. So one of the elements that we really want to share with the colleagues who we have not yet visited is that when we come to your institution, it's really about also sharing the successes of what you have achieved. Because in the end, the information gathered through this audit will be open for the sector to guide the sector and also to strengthen own implementation plans. That was shared also this morning by DHET, which will be one of the big requirements coming forward. We will also share our preliminary report in the coming weeks that will also incorporate some of the discussions and information that was shared today and also will be shared tomorrow. So other lessons that we've learned is that the qualitative nature of the discussions that takes place on the day really is useful to contextualize the quantitative information that we gather through the questionnaires. And there's also a lot of benefits in terms of the site visits if it's a co-branded exercise. If it's not just, in a way, us coming to your university and conducting the audit, but also a joint process to make sure that the right people are invited, that it's broadly advertised and broadly attended. What we also want to stress is really not a fault-finding mission. It's really about taking stock, as the chair also mentioned, really knowing what is available in the sector and where we need to focus our attention as a sector. One of the elements that we've also picked up is that we, in a way, need to start moving from a more institutional mindset around language policy implementation and also see that as how our institutional resources can be there to benefit the sector and South Africa as a whole. And what was also definitely picked up is that it was a useful self-reflective exercise for universities. As in some of the discussions, a lot of staff and students learned for the first time that there were certain services and data sets available for their institution. So in terms of the diversity of people who have completed the questionnaire to date, as you can see, there's a lot of different languages represented by students as well as staff. And again, language is deeply personal of nature. And we've also asked the question, as part of the questionnaire, really what can be done to foster and build and develop your mother tongue, to also really get that personal buy-in and personal perspectives as part of the audit. The discussions really has been robust to date, and what's important to foster when we continue with the audit is to make it clear that there must be a shared understanding that multilingualism in this context does not entail the replacement of specific languages in favor of others, but it's really about unlocking access in many different ways by providing more resources in different languages. We must foster a culture of contribution, and we must realize that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this project. And the text now is so small there, I'm not sure I can read it, but I'll try to summarize from memory. So in terms of the preliminary feedback, in terms of resources that's available, this we gathered from typical resources to check what is the availability of that, and then also asked follow-on questions in terms of other resources that was not yet mentioned. And what we found, there's resources from translation services, proofreading services, editing services, voiceover, annotation, text-to-speech, speech-to-text, sign language support. There is so much happening at different universities. But the reality is not everybody knows about it. As part of the rest of the audit, we will be conducting some follow-up exercises with the university that we've conducted site visits at to now delve deeper and understand. If you say you are translating, in what subjects? If you say you have glossaries, in what subject fields. So we really start painting a picture of what is available in the sector so that if there's, let's say, engineering degree, that we don't start and develop the same terminology list that's already been developed many times over at different universities. So that's also a part that we will be conducting in the next 6 months. In terms of a more high-level exercise, and I'm going to borrow the words that was said this morning by one of the speakers, that still points to, in certain cases, as a checklist exercise in a way, when we ask the question of whether a university has a language policy in place. So one of the universities that we visited was still very early in the process, as they are a very new university. So in their cases, it can still be, let's say, it might not yet be available, but there was still quite a substantial amount of respondents that mentioned that they are unsure or they don't know whether their university has a language policy in place. And that in a way points towards that what we do around this might not yet be ingrained in the culture of our institutions, and that's something that we need to work on. This culture of sharing and creating an environment where multilingualism can grow. And some of the comments there, I'll try to, maybe I must rather just look to my back and then read from there. But these are some of the comments that we received at some of the site visits, is to show this interaction between lecturers and students, where students, if they're uncertain, they have the space to ask for another definition in another language. They have the space to engage with their lecturers in one-on-one sessions where another language might be used to explain certain concepts. And I think the most important bit for me that comes out is that the whole class is the resource. It's not just the lecturer that's in front that now needs to speak every language and have every definition available. But if there's a space where students can share their definitions with each other, that's something that we must really foster, because that will take us forward. I think the same example of the question about the VCs, how many VCs are here? Yes, it would be great if every person, every senior manager would be in this room, but in the end, it's all of us that will make the difference and can contribute to the change that is needed. In terms of feedback on resources that's still required, and this is more an experiential question, because in many cases there might already be dictionaries, there might already be translation services, but if you experience your university or your institution in a different way, that still points towards possible culture or certain elements that has not yet been communicated well or robustly. And the question around whether a university is monolingual, bilingual, or multilingual, you can see the majority pointed towards bilingual, towards multilingualism, but there's still a lot of students as well as staff that experience their university as a monolingual institution. And again, that points and in a way correlates with the information around knowledge about multilingualism plans and policies that's available at institutions. In terms of specific areas that was identified as not being available, and that was already from our colleague from NMU shared also some of those elements already in her talk. From students, there was also quite a call for teaching subjects in African languages, ensuring that there's practical books, prescribed books available in African languages, introducing classes that allow them to learn different languages. And I think the important bit, again, that was stressed this morning as well, or in the first part of the session, to involve students when developing language policies and plans to understand their needs as well. And that's also the big part why we also decided to make sure that there's a session dedicated to get student input as part of the audit, as well as not only staff input at institutions. A big part in terms of staff comments, in terms of what was missing, it was specifically around capacity, in terms of a lot of lecturers or staff, even though there might be a will to change things, there might not be necessarily the capacity to really take up the charge to do certain things. There's also some comments around attitudes around multilingualism at higher education that might need to change. I think the important bit, and I hope that is something that we hear as a collective here, is these challenges are not something that can be fixed by a lone institution. It really asks for much broader engagement. And in terms of milestones, what we can see here from the different universities that we visited, I would like to take a brief moment, I still have a small bit of time left, to actually just read through those comments from the different universities. At VUT, it was noted the university supported the review of the language policy and accepted to move from monolingual to multilingual. And this was related to a unit that was established. It was launched, which advocated the development of historical marginalized languages. So that's an example of really a success that VUT has reached. In terms of UNISA, every academic department has a language committee that ensures that communication in teaching and learning is translated to the languages that are prevalent in that particular module. We also develop glossaries for the entire discipline, and in the process of developing subject-specific glossaries. So again, great successes, great processes that can possibly be copied and learned from at other institutions. At UMP, it was noted, even though we do not have an official language policy yet, we currently embrace the usage of African languages such as isiNdebele and Siswati on both campuses, and Sepedi on the Siyabuswa campus. So again, very practical examples of how institutions are making do with what they have and really making impact in that regard. To summarize the information that we've gathered to date, as well as from the site visits, is that there's a lot of shared challenges and shared opportunities for the sector that cuts across your typical institutional boundaries. And one of the key things that we believe we should move towards is really a shared resources model, where we know what's available in the sector, we know what to develop, and we don't duplicate efforts, but really build on what is available there in a coordinated fashion. I think the summarization of that was also mentioned earlier this morning by Prof. Langa was shared challenges requires shared solutions. And we need to build on the goodwill that is available at our institutions. It is there, we just need to take it up. Right, last slide. In terms of way forward, a critical path towards a possible way forward. And that's something that we want to pose for a thought to consider for this colloquium. At the first point, the audit will provide a state of the art in terms of what is available in the sector and possibly identify initial first areas that could be considered to be developed. But then after that, there must be a proposal to be tabled around how can a collective network model be developed or a 5-year plan be developed in terms of what we want to achieve with the language policy framework, how we can implement that in the sector. And there's certain prerequisites for that, certain dependencies that must be in place, and that is specifically looking at a shared platform that can facilitate interaction and take away barriers of access, a possible independent platform that can facilitate outside of individual institutions. It is not possible for a single institution alone to really make this a success. And I think we need to change our mindset around funds to an institution versus funds to the sector. And I think that's one area that I'm not sure whether the D8 is still online, but I think that's an area that must really be considered to say, yes, there's part of the policy that noted that inter-institutional or collaborative projects would receive separate funding. But a big part about giving funding to institutions is to know that the funding can actually build the whole sector and that there's some form of coordination happening in that regard, that we don't necessarily see it as funding that's just available for this university. We must see what we're doing for the sector, we're doing for the country, we're doing for the languages. And in that case, we really need that open mindset when we go forward. And we think as part of a shared model or a collective network model, it might be a way forward that can enable sharing and more efficient use of the resources that we have in the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stein, for sharing that comprehensive report. Ladies and gentlemen, the facilitator who's going to dissect the presentation given by Mr. Stein as well as Professor Khumalo is Dr. Gia Sishoka, who is the Director of Language Directorate at Northwest University. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Information Science, specializing in publishing, Bachelor of Arts with honors, Master of Arts in African Languages cum laude, Doctor of Philosophy in African Languages. She has been instrumental in developing African languages-related projects, such as establishing the language unit at Road Accident Fund and terminology developments in various entities and government departments. On top of that, she has extensive experience as a language practitioner and language specialist in the different government departments in South Africa. Furthermore, as a former linguist at the Parliament of South Africa, she has been instrumental in developing language-related innovations. Dr. Gia, over to you. I think I mentioned that you have a cum laude, so I'm speaking with you. People who obtain their degrees with cum laude, if you don't say cum laude, you are in trouble. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Prof. Good afternoon to all my colleagues. My duty is so simple. My duty is just to note hands, listen to the questions, note them, cut you if you are telling us, if you are giving us an abstract, and just guide you and stop you when I have to stop you. That is my duty. But the most important thing I've been giving is to listen more and not listen to respond, but listen to understand. So ladies and gentlemen, our topic that we're going to look into is the range of resources required and providing strategy necessary to enable the implementation of the policy framework. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning we have deliberated on the problems, on what we have seen. Mr. Johan has also given us the state of resources in some of the institutions. So now, ladies and gentlemen, my duty is to allow the floor to pose questions regarding to the strategies that we need to come up with and to define the range of resources that are needed for us to move forward. Now we're talking about forward we go. Remember the topic that we are on, ladies and gentlemen, is about harnessing the resources. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'm going to note your hand and don't read as a thesis, just summarize your thesis. Thank you so much. Prof. Langa, are you coming here? Oh, I need a tablet. Yo. The instructions are clear. Questions are on the tablet.
Thank you very much, Chair. You have made your task very clear to all of us. But colleagues, I think John Stein was standing here and there was not that much of a background about him. And I'm coming to just insert that detail so that we know who was talking to us for close to 25 minutes. John Stein is the Director of Operations at SADILA, which is the short for South African Center for Digital Language Resources. And as he explicated, the task was for SADILA to go across the academy to get a sense of the state of the art, what is available at our universities, where are the gaps, and how can we then, out of those gaps and what is available, can we formulate something that can be a strategy to model something that can effectively implement the policy. I just wanted for you to know who the person who spoke to you for 25 minutes was and where he is coming from. But because I thought that was missed. And then now you can actually pose questions to him.
Thank you, Prof. Langa. I'm noting the questions. Can you lift up our hands, raise up our hands? I'm taking the first round. As I'm taking the first round, I'm noting questions. I'm just taking questions. Then I'm gonna spontaneously choose somebody to respond. If the question is not asked to a relevant person, we've got experts in this house that are going to give us expert advice. So I see Prof at the back. Any takers? Okay, 2 questions. Let's start with Prof.
Thank you very much. Question. I want to ask a question on copyright. Whether your survey really also ask if those materials are open sources or they are accessible to. So I think that to me is a very important question.
Can you repeat that again?
The question of copyright.
Okay.
If the materials that they are auditing are copyrighted by the institution, if they are, what kind of a copyright is that? Is that open source or what?
Okay, question taken. Prof. Longa?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Program Director. My question, first of all, let me thank John for the presentation and also Prof. Khumalo for the presentation in terms of the audit that has been done. My one, Prof. Khumalo, is with regard to SADILA. Could we get an audit of SADILA in terms of its mandate? What resources are now available from SADILA that are ready to be shared with all the universities in terms of SADILA mandate? So that will be my request, in addition to all the audits that are taking place, visiting all the other institutions. But we need to see and and also maybe learn from what has been done and how institutions are benefiting from the work that has been done by SADILA, because like, it's quite a lot of work that has been done there. But like in terms of how it has been shared and all of that, that's very, very important. Thank you.
Prof. Langa, you know question 2 is for you. Thank you. Mr. Dantile.
Thank you. Mine is not a question. Is again, not to anyone, but to this august house, to think again about some of the treaties that South Africa is part of, as much as it is not officially signed. Also, we need to persuade the Department of Higher Education to invest in a long-term strategy in this process, not 3 years, especially of this treaty, which is the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and how then as a country we contribute into saying at least by 2023 we have minimum bilingual or multilingual universities in South Africa offering probably all the courses or 50% of the courses by 2023 in various languages. Then we are talking about strategy in terms of the available resources and the resources that we'll need. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Khalakhala, I would like you to respond to the copyright question, that how do we work around copyrights? Can we hand over the mic to Prof. Khalakhala to respond to that?
Thank you, Chair. This is a spur of the moment. Anyway, I think Prof. Matiba is raising a very important question, and I wouldn't want to direct it to SADILA, but across universities, because we've been doing a lot of work in our corners, but we don't seem to consolidate and share the work so that we can push the implementation agenda to a high level. And I think this is one of the major challenges that we are encountering, in this whole movement. So my sense is perhaps universities should open up, should also create spaces where we would be willing to share the resources. I think Prof. Matiba, you will recall that there was a discussion around this to say, whilst you're at UCT, that you have all these materials that have been sort of put together to support the teaching and learning and creating access, the success, with a very explicit agenda. And the multilingual glossaries were, in a way, in the center of that movement. CPUT has the same, UNESA has the same. You can go on. But then when it comes to us consolidating, we're not willing, for whatever reason. So I think it's counterproductive. So maybe SADILA could guide us in terms of the strategy and also willing horses like specific universities who could sort of present their case studies, and I'm sure we can learn more from that. Maybe I can also add on the issue of resources. We tend to forget about the human resource group, the people who should be in the forefront of this business across universities. I was just sharing with colleagues outside to say, maybe at a strategic level, there is a need for us to create these structures within the office of the Vice Chancellor, and there has to be some representation from council. You know, if we begin to talk about council language committee, where you would have 1 or 2 members of council who would ask from time to time us to report on our progress going forward. I thought it's just a thought.
Thank you so much. That was a summarized thesis, full thesis. Thank you, Prof. Over to you, Prof. Langa. On SADILA, what is the mandate of SADILA and how is SADILA supporting other institutions? Prof. Langa, over to you.
John Stein could have taken this question as well, but yeah, I will take it nevertheless. The mandate of SADILA is to identify resources, or to develop resources, or to share digital language resources for the development and use of African languages in the academy and even in developing downstream technologies in other sectors such as the industry. That's the broad mandate of SADILA. It has 2 programs. One is the digitization program, which speaks to NLP work, natural language processing work, HLT development, machine learning technologies for African languages. And the second one is the digital humanities program, which lends itself to human capacity development, training, identifying and training people in the humanities and social sciences to have the computational uptake that is required to develop technologies for use in the development of our African languages. So those are 2 main programs. But maybe to relate, because I know Professor Hlonga, and I think she wants me to proceed this way. How can we use the infrastructure to enable the implementation of this policy as part of the solutions that we are going to generate here? And I think when we are talking about identifying resources, we need to actually say, what is it that we need for a language X to be able to function as a language that Professor Prau was explicating in his keynote? We need resources such as your orthographies, resources such as your multimodal lexicons, resources such as your grammars. So linked to technological tools, it would be your spelling checkers, it will be your speech-to-text technologies, it will be your grammar checkers, etc., etc. We need those affordances in order for us to say this language is actually well equipped for it to be used in the context of teaching and learning and research, etc. And this is not to put the cart ahead of the horses. We need for us here, as you actually introduced this panel, this discussion, for us here to say, these are the resources that we need. SADILA has given us the broad brushstrokes of what the sector says we have. And Professor Pras said we have all the things that we need, the expertise here. So we need to think how to harness this whole gamut of resources. That's what we need. And I think John said something about shared challenges, shared solutions. We need to think about not looking at this from a navel-gazing point of view, but from a whole sectorial point of view. How do we share these resources effectively if we want for this policy to be translated from a policy document to an implementation framework? And I think that's in part what Professor Khalakhala was trying to say. We have been doing a lot of this work. It hasn't brought us anywhere, as Prof. Pra gave the indictment. We need to do something. And I think this conversation is that which we want to do. What is it that we need to do? Because we have given you the state of the art, and you know what you've been doing in your silos. What is it that we need to do? Because we're not waiting for anyone here to come and tell us what we need to do. We have to do that, document it, create a model, and then say, this is the model that is going to usher us towards implementation. I hope I answered that.
Thank you so much. The third question was from Mr. Dantile. I don't think it was a question. He was just warning us as we go forward with our strategies that let us take into cognizance the fact of the different treaties that already exist within the government spaces so that we don't find ourselves reallocating resources that already are there. We need to also make our universities aware of such treaties that are there. Colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, I want to open the floor again. Prof. Langa has said, and the session really is for us to come up with strategies. One of the strategies that Yuan has said is that we need to develop a 5-year model. Now, my question back to you, Han, is that now who's gonna lead the development of the model? And starting when? We've spoken, we've had colloquiums, now it's time to implement. So this session is for us to come up with a unified strategy on how we're gonna use these resources collaboratively to make sure that we harness everything that our universities have developed up to so far. Because in the morning, Prof. Kwesi has said it, we have the resources. Now, what do we do? The question now is how? Because the policy framework is there. Now, how? I want you to take us through the how part.
Okay, it's on, thanks. So in terms of the how, one of the key things that also subtler what I can add on to what Prof. Langa said is we, in a way, play the role of a non-competing aggregator. So we don't take copyright ownership of things that's hosted with us, but we can take care of things that are there. Because in many ways, you sometimes, let's say, somebody develops a terminology list, and they have all these resources, and then they retire, and it goes nowhere. So in many ways, entities such as Subtler, I mean, we're not the only entity that can do these type of things, can look after certain resources that's in the sector to make sure that people know where it is, know who to speak to, know how to access it, and also if there's something that it stays viable, it stays up with the latest technology that is available in the environment. To answer the question around how, so the first part of the audit that we focus on is really understanding what is available, and then as part of that, we will provide, in a way, a platform, most probably within the next 6 months of next year, where that will enable you to filter through the things that you need. So let's say you're interested in accounting and you need terminology lists for that. You can utilize that. You can say, okay, at UNISA, there's terminology lists in accounting. And at UCT, there's a course degree in accounting. So for instance, a place, an aggregator for the sector to have the metadata available. So you can search for what is already out there. And that can then also enable us to see there's clearly a big gap in, let's say, chemistry terminology. So let's take our resources, we put it towards that, and also as part of the resources, we know then at this university we have isiZulu terminologists, at that university we have Sesotho terminologists, so channel the work to there. There is resources available for the sector. The work is done there, it aggregates back to the sector. But in order to do that, we need to change our mindset around open access, open science in general, because the copyright issue is a real issue. A university owns the IP of things that's generated, and in many ways, it is seen as this terminology list, this dictionary, this app, it's ours. It costs money to develop. We don't want to just give it away. But I think it's almost a certain level of game theory. If everybody contributes, everybody will gain from that regard. So just to summarize very briefly, again, the audit results will be in a platform that will help identify certain gaps, and in a way, Subtler can play a role, or entities like Subtler can play a role to help aggregate the resources and point us to where we need to focus our development.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor again for questions. Remember what we are dealing with at the moment, ladies and gentlemen, is what other strategies are necessary. So when you respond to this question, you're coming up with strategies that are necessary to enable implementation of the policy framework. So we need strategies, ladies and gentlemen. What other strategies? Ioane said collaborated effort. Prof. Langa said, let's use SADILA. Prof. Longwa says, let's be aware of what SADILA can offer. Mr. Dantile said, let's also use the policies that are already available to take leave from that. So what other strategies, ladies and gentlemen? Can I see a show of hands so that I can note them? And I see a hand, I saw a hand somewhere. Oh yes, Prof, I saw a hand, I see 1, 2. Other hands, ladies and gentlemen? All right, we've got 2 hands, can go.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to bring into the room what has been discussed at COPAL, because I feel that we really need to recognize COPAL and the work that has been done and the discussions that are taking place there. One of the strategies that was suggested is more on the regional collaborations. For instance, in the Eastern Cape, we have Walter Sisulu University, Rhodes University, Nelson Mandela, and University of Fort Hare. And we suggested that perhaps those universities can actually have as well a metadata that is available, so that when we compare what we have with universities such as Western Cape, UCT, Stellenbosch, that is the universities that offer isiXhosa as well, at least we know that, you know, this is data for isiXhosa, this is what we have from all these. So I think the strategy that I wanted to bring forth, which was suggested by COPAL, is regional collaborations as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Expand on that and ask, could we think towards inter-regional collaborations? I think, Johan, you might have answered this question, but I'm going to re-ask it in case you didn't. So if I have colleagues at a different university who are capable of translating material into Setswana or Sesotho, I am just, I think, asking people who are in executive management at universities, what are the things that I must look out for? What is potential red tape that prevents us across universities of working together and creating a joint resource?
Thank you so much. Joint resource, Juan?
Yes, I think that is specifically where senior management at university must play a big role to give the okay to do that. In the same way that, for instance, USAF endorsed the audit so that we can go out to university, senior management must say, yes, work together, you may. Because the reality is there are certain policies, I mean, the NW just recently revised their IP policy in terms of what is IP, how does it work, specifically in the Creative Commons space. But that people understand that they are able to collaborate, and there are ways to still show this is something that was developed by the Northwest University or by UP, but it is shared, it's open, it's licensed on the Creative Commons, people can reuse it, people can build on it. And I think there's something small that I would like to add about this. We're talking about this from a very, let's say, we as service provider to the students' view, but there's also elements of the resources. If they are open enough, students can also make use of them. If there's videos that has captions underneath them in different languages and they're able to search for that, they can be studying at UP, but they can look at the lectures at CPUT. So there's also that element of really thinking about, I can almost say, this YouTube space for the higher education sector where there's a lot of resources available and people are able to search for something that's relevant for them to the need that they have at that point, at that moment.
Okay, I see Prof. Langa, then Prof. Toby.
Hello. Okay, shouldn't have done that. Just to add on what John has mentioned, and this is something that has emerged from our contact with all the universities, is that universities are, and we must appreciate that, very competitive spaces. competitive in a very good way, and each university wants to lead in a particular space, and they don't want to lose that leadership role, you know. And I think what you are asking, especially as it relates to what also the Vice Chair of COPAL and the conversation that COPAL, is that without losing that competitive edge, let us share these resources, even when we're starting at a regional level, where we are actually developing similar language typologies, and provide those resources without UCT losing its advantage over Stellenbosch, and without Rhodes losing its advantage over NMU. Okay, it can be the other way around as well. I know I'm dabbling into politics already. But again, it speaks to exactly what I'm talking about, this competitiveness. But if we want to do what PRA was trying to tell us to step up and do, we have to lose this institutional character of competing in every single innovative space. And we can do that in two ways. We can say, okay, let us have this resource infrastructure sitting outside any of these universities, because these universities are always going to be competing, overtly or covertly. So we have an infrastructure that is outside the university infrastructures to develop and make these resources available to all the universities, or to actually start with regional small-scale collaboration. And in that way, because if we are doing something on East Coast, at Rhodes, as you are doing it at Stellenbosch, as you are doing it at UCT, there is no one who has the advantage there but the language speakers and the people that want to practice in that language. Those are the people that have advantage. Your competitive advantages will be seen in the productive papers, academic papers that you produce, away from the resources that we need for advancing these languages. I think we have to tease, again, as the key word, tease apart those type of nuances. Otherwise, we are going to be going back to our enclaves again, CPUT, UWC, and say, okay, across the road, actually, these two, across the road. You do yours closer, and we do ours closer in Afrikaans, and we don't care what you're doing across the road. But that is what has brought us here. And we're saying, let us unlock a model, a new model that is going to work for all universities, irregardless, or regardless. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Prof. Toby and Prof. Khala and Doc there. Mr. Gandhi, going once. Afterwards, I'm not going to open the floor again. So we're closing with Mr. Gandhi. There's Prof. Toby first,
right.
Then Prof. Khala.
Thank you, Chairperson. I don't want to reiterate what Prof. Langa has just said, but I think as part of the strategy, if we want to make notes for the strategy, I think there are two things that I would like to contribute. The first is that it should, what Prof. Langa has just said, should be part of this whole strategy. How can universities collaborate? Because indeed it is a case, if you're going to ask me for some help, perhaps I've got the skill, I've got the know-how, but I also have to teach, I also have to do research, I also have community engagement projects, etc., etc. So it's easier said than done, but I agree with Prof. Langa, we need this whole model that university managements should buy into. That's the one comment on strategy going forward. And then the other comment is, I think we should emphasize human capacity development. We might have translators, we might have technological experts or whatever at my institution, but how can we support another institution that does not have those kinds of things? So if we can focus on capacity development as well.
Thank you. We are on strategy number 11, Prof. Langa. We are making notes. Yes, strategy number 11. Number 12 from Prof. Khala.
Once again, I think we have best practices in certain institutions where we can learn some of the developmental initiatives. And I think the establishment of language centers across universities might take us a little far.
So we may have to consider that seriously, because it then ties neatly nicely with, you know, the budget vote. There's something that we refer to it as a budget vote. When we do the allocation for resources across universities, we would then know that you know, a portion of the budget will be dedicated to language matters, and that goes straight to the language center and its activities, which would obviously be meant to drive, you know, the language development agenda. So that is one strategy. But again, the change of mindset, there is a perception error that anything that has to do with language should be dumped in the humanities. In most universities, which is a major problem, because if the natural sciences, law, economics and management science say, oh, well, it's a humanities problem. But it is a university-wide challenge because it affects all students, not necessarily students in the humanities. My sense then is that there has to be a way of rethinking, you know, that and deal with that perception error. And then we're likely to move forward. The other issue is the involvement of students. And, you know, when we had the Roads Must Fall, you will recall this, and also take into account, you know, the movement which emerged at Stellenbosch, you know, Open Stellenbosch. It was a movement against Afrikaans, but we were never given an alternative to say, in the event that we deal with Afrikaans, let's lift African languages. I think Kwesipra put it so nicely to say, if you lift the language, you lift the people. So the argument did not go beyond the issue of Afrikaans. It was all about, you know, let's get rid of Afrikaans. Indirectly, we were saying English should be the way to go. So I think there has to be a way of mobilizing around that, because students are in the center of this movement, so they need to drive it from their angle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Langa, I appreciate that one has to start somewhere, and hence your focus on regional collaboration. But I just want to emphasize the fact that students who speak Sotho or Setswana or Tsonga do not stay in specific regions. We have a large collection of students who we cannot support because we do not have the manpower and the capacity, but our fellow universities do.
Thank you so much. Mr. Mgandi.
Thank you, Chair. In fact, my points that I wanted to make, I think Prof. Khala has taken two of them. One is the issue of capacitating the language managers. I think we speak very less of that aspect. Language managers to deal with the complexity of the task at hand, insofar as finances are concerned, insofar as resources that we are talking about, and insofar as liaising with the academic departments in executing their mandate, because the issue of language development is very complex, and it needs people who understand the complexities that are involved in it, including the technological advances that we are experiencing at the moment. That's the first point. Perhaps to add into that point, the establishment of Directors Forum or Language Directors Forum, I think it's very important, so that
we understand as universities where we are insofar as the management of language is concerned. That's the first point. And the second point, extending what Prof. Khalakhala was saying, I think we need to take the discussion back to our colleagues at universities, those that are not necessarily linguists, but who are busy with their academic work in health sciences, in IT, in law, in commerce, because what I've observed in the project that we are involved in, that you are very much aware of, Chair, the Bakonde project, is that there is so much wealth of knowledge from people who are not necessarily linguists, but who are academics in their respective spaces. So we need to take our conversation back to them to say, how can you assist us in developing these languages? I do think that they have a big role to play. And then perhaps lastly, the issue of language awareness. We need to establish structures right from top, from the council right down to the cleaners, that are specifically looking at how we can canvass this issue of language development. In every school board, in every faculty board, in every departmental meeting, there has to be an item that speaks to what we are talking about here. So that when we are reporting, as Higher Education was saying, we need to report on an annual basis. We report something that is solid. We report something that is comprehensive. So those are the points that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Round of applause for all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. We really came up with about 20 strategies that I've noted that are practicable, that are can be practically implemented, not just theorizing everything. And Prof. Langa and the Yusuf and Kopal colleagues, it's very important that we go back to the drawing board and implement the strategies. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, my task was just to listen more and not make further comments. So I'll hand over back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seshoka. Professor Nkomo, do you want to close your session or you are covered? Okay. Okay. You are being a lawyer, Professor Nkomo. It's fine. It's fine. Thank you very much for that instructive conversation, colleagues. It's very instrumental. But what really boggled my mind as I was sitting down, oh, by the way, you are at the University of Pretoria. Colleagues, just be warned, when you mention faculties, you start with law and other faculties. We, just to remind colleagues, we are the #1 faculty in South Africa, as well as in Africa. So, please, you start with law and others. It's the norm for the reception to be warm. Thank you. As I was sitting down listening to the speakers, what boggled my mind was the language policy, the framework itself, and the gentleman at the back mentioned the language and the caveat there. My question is, would it not be helpful for this policy to be developed or written originally in indigenous languages to help us fully comprehend them? Because them written in English, we are saying it must follow the current bureaucracy and challenges which we have in universities. So I think we also have to look into that, because you can't say, let's promote Afrikaans and use an English policy. There, the position was clear: promote Afrikaans with policy directives of Afrikaans. So I think we have to also look into that as we are continuing with this journey. Professor Langa, we are universities, and as you know, UP is #1 in the country. We'll continue to compete, but on this one, we will collaborate. Don't steal our shine. Thank you. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we are drawing close to the end of the program. The reason why we want to release you early is we requested at UP that you are to receive the Pala Pala report in indigenous languages so that you are to comprehend it better. If I was the representative of the president, I would have made representations in Chivenda. Probably Justice Ngobo would have arrived at a different conclusion. Sometimes, you know, we shoot our foot in ourselves in the foot by not using the resources at our disposal. Mother tongue will really get you out of trouble. Yes. Let me now invite again Dr. Matutu, the Chief Executive Officer, to come and bring and to share closing remarks, and then I will share the announcements. Dr. Matutu, I want to introduce you again. The colleagues now know you, and we know you. Transformation is beautiful, colleagues, whether you like it or not. Thank you.
Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. It has been quite a thought-provoking session, starting from 1 o'clock up to now. And definitely, I hope that it will further drive the debate as it has been promised, that it's taking the debate forward. So the first session that we had, of course, it framed the conference properly, where we had the Vice Chancellor, myself, Professor Langa, and by that time, I thought that everybody was clear on why we are here and what we are intending to do. And then we had Professor Pra, who challenged us to action. And I think that we have to keep that in mind. We have been challenged to action, and he's been very clear that we're not short of anything. We have all the expertise, we have all the resources. He doesn't understand exactly what we're short of. And I do think that it's important for us to start to prioritize, because certainly there is a way in which he's thinking, which is different from the way in which we're thinking, where we are putting this and that and that and that. In his thinking, he's very clear. You start here if you're going to be developing a language, you move here, you move to this stage, you move to that stage. And that is what I gathered, which I think I'm missing in this room. From here, I got a sense that we are, you know, looking at all the nice to haves, all the fundamentals, and I do think that we need to get to the bottom of the fundamentals to get us where we need to be. Mr. Mabizela spoke about the resources, thinking along the lines of single universities, single projects over a 3-year period. And we got a sense that if we're going to succeed, we need to get out of that thinking. We need to think at a sector level in terms of the resource mobilization. So if there are priorities at a sector level, it becomes much more easier to even fundraise for them, even outside the Department of Higher Education and Training, because there's this whole sector-wide platform, for instance, which was suggested by the SADILA, that there are these resources to be shared. The Vice Chancellor of this university said on all languages they've got translated, I don't know what, with UCT, and that's open for everyone to use within the sector. All that it requires is a platform for sharing, and then everybody has access. So if we talk about sharing platforms, for instance, what do we mean? What scale are we looking at? What can be shared at a national level? What can be shared at a provincial level, as some of the discussions were provided? And generally, if we are thinking along the lines of collaboration, there needs to be incentives and rewards for collaboration. The person who was saying, you are busy with teaching, we are busy with research, we are busy with community engagement, was telling the truth. So it becomes important to create the rewards and incentives for people to work together. And in my view, when we're talking institutions such as USAF, such as DHET, it's important that we think along these lines. We have the resources. Now, how do we create incentives and enablers for these resources to be properly mobilized for the greater good of the country? I had the approach of the provincial platforms, and looking within the natural sciences sector, it is apparent that the approach sometimes is that of looking at either geographic advantage or looking at where certain areas are strong. And on occasions where there has been successful sharing of resources, like in areas such as nanotechnology, such as digital sciences, where we're talking about UWC, working with UJ, working with some Zululand, or in digital sciences, where we're talking about vendor, working with VETS, working with Solplaki, you'll find out that there have been enablers, there have been incentives for those things to happen, where the Department of Science and Innovation, for instance, funds what needs to happen, and then there's collaboratively, qualifications developed collaboratively. They decide on which infrastructure stays at which universities for the greater good of the entire sector. So those are things that we need to start looking at if we are talking about resource sharing. And we have been thinking along the lines of infrastructure development. Human capital development has been mentioned both at the level of the people here and also at the level of managers. And this thing has been done. If you look at programs such as the HELM, Higher Education Leadership Management, which has mobilized the entire higher education when it comes to leadership and management, that program is being funded by the University Capacity Development Program of DHET. It is seated within USAF. So these things can be done. They require us to just think broadly on where we want certain things to be located and why. And then we start to look for funding, whether it's local funding or international funding that we're talking about. So, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, I would like to close this colloquium as I opened it in the morning for today. We're going to start again tomorrow, and I think the announcement for the cocktail will be made by our ably program director. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matutu, for the closing remarks. Colleagues, you are kindly requested, there's a vehicle, a Toyota KR43 TYGP, Toyota KR43 TYGP, to please move. You are stopping us from going to enjoy the cocktail. Please move your vehicle, Toyota KR43TY. Colleagues, we've now come to the end of day one. At the cocktail, no speeches at the cocktail are allowed. You will be treated harshly if you start with speeches. Professor Khalakhala, your request for us to slaughter a sheep is granted. We have a farm at UP, and we won't be accused of animal cruelty. Ladies and gentlemen, those in the auditorium and online, thank you very much for joining us on day one, and we look forward to receiving you tomorrow, 8:49, to resume with this important work. Those online, it is a good evening from our side. We will definitely indulge on your behalf. And those who are in the Senate Hall, right after the Senate Hall, please exit to your vehicles. Security officials are waiting you to direct you straight to Pure Cafe. The colleagues at Pure are waiting for you. So as you enter, the party will start. Thank you, colleagues. Good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.